Close your eyes and listen to the wind. Far in the north of Britain lies a land of rolling hills, fading ruins, and skies that stretch forever. Quiet now, but once alive with kingdoms, warriors, and wandering poets. This was the Old North, the Hen Ogledd, where names like Reged and Godin meant power. After Rome fell, this became a land of survival, mystery, and legend. Its story isn't told in books, but in stones, in whispers, in wind. So settle in, breathe slow, and drift back into a time half remembered. A world between empires, where myth and memory walk hand in hand. After the fall, when the roads went quiet, after the Roman legions left Britain, there was no grand farewell, no final ceremony, no message to the people, no solemn proclamation echoing through the towns, just silence, quiet, the kind that seeps into the walls, into the soil, into the bones of the land itself. For almost 4 centuries, Rome had been here. The eagle banners had flown high above the forts. The governors had ruled from mosaic-floored villas. Taxes had been collected, laws enforced, roads paved, and towns carefully laid out in grids. For generations, people had lived in the rhythm of the empire, its laws, its protection, its grain shipments, its gods. And then, sometime in the early 5th century, it stopped. The legions were recalled to the continent, needed for battles closer to the imperial heart. Rome itself was under threat, cracking at the seams. Britain, once a proud outpost of the empire, was simply left behind. At first it didn't feel like the end. The buildings still stood, the marketplaces still bustled, if a little more quietly. People still bathed in Roman baths, and lit lamps with Roman oil. Some local councils tried to keep order, some commanders declared themselves protectors, a few even claimed to be emperors in their own right. But over time the scaffolding began to collapse, the roads fell into disrepair, the towns began to shrink, the coins lost their shine, villas were abandoned, their walls crumbling to dust. And in the north, where the land was always harder, the winters longer, the frontier closer, the unraveling was faster. The roads, they were the first to grow silent, built by engineers who knew how to tame rivers and carve through hills. They had once connected every corner of Britain, stone paved, straight, and enduring. You can still find them today, under motorways and farm tracks. Back then, they were lifelines, for soldiers, for merchants, for messengers. But without Rome, there were fewer messages, fewer orders, fewer reasons to march. Imagine walking one of those roads then, the stones cracked, weeds pushing through, the hedges wild, the mile markers faded, no carts, no travelers, just wind, the quiet kind, that whispers of things long gone. The towns along the way, like Coria, Oberacum, Luguvallium, became islands of uncertainty. Some tried to carry on, others were raided, some were simply forgotten. Yet even in this fading world, life went on, not as it had, but still. People adapted, they built over the old, they moved back into hill forts that had stood empty since the Iron Age. They clustered near rivers, forests, and defensible high places. It wasn't just collapse, it was transformation. In the ruins of bathhouses, sheep grazed. In crumbling temples, Christian crosses were carved. In former granaries, families huddled for warmth. And out in the countryside, old tribal identities began to stir again. Names like Brigantes, Votadini, and Selgovae, once suppressed under Roman rule, found new breath. A new kind of Britain was taking shape, one not of emperors and armies, but of small warbands and fragile alliances, local leaders, river kings, fort lords, men who ruled not with bureaucracies, but with blades and reputation. In this new world, power was no longer measured in taxes or treaties, but in cattle, in warriors, in kinship bonds. The land of the north, what we now call Cumbria, Northumberland, the borders, became a wild, uncertain space, a place where old Roman roads became hunting paths, where watchtowers became bandit camps, where ancient stones remembered more than the people living among them. And through it all, the people endured. They remembered stories, they kept traditions alive, some Roman, some older still. They sang songs of heroes past and present, of battles fought, and fields sown. In this silence, a different voice began to rise, one not dictated by Rome, but born from the soil itself. This was the beginning of the Hen Ogledd, the Old North. Not a single kingdom, but many. Not one language, but many tongues. Brittonic, Latin, a bit of Irish, and soon the guttural edge of Germanic voices, arriving on the wind. The roads may have gone quiet, But the story was only beginning, and if you walked one of those roads today, in the blue hush of dusk, with the heather brushing your knees and the sky wide above you, you might just feel it. The pulse of the past, the breath of the old north, still rising from the earth. Lie back, breathe slow, and let the road take you further. The last city, Carlisle. Today, it's a modest city near the English-Scottish border, a place of stone walls and quiet streets, of train stations and market squares, but long ago, it was something more, something older. Its Roman name was Lugavalium, and in the long shadow after the Empire's retreat, it may have been the last true city in Roman Britain. Picture it, the early 5th century. The Empire is gone. Across the island, towns are fading, shrinking, emptying. Villas stand deserted, once grand roads begin to crumble, and the countryside reverts to forest and field. But here, in the northwest, along the great defensive spine of Hadrian's Wall, life continues in ways few would expect. Carlisle does not vanish, it adapts. Its city council, or what remains of it, still meets. Traders still come to market. Children play in the shadow of crumbling bathhouses. Roman stonework still anchors homes, and along the wall, in forts like Burdoswald and Vindolanda, people continue to live. Not just squatters or refugees, but organized communities. They till the land, raise livestock, repair what they can. They speak Latin, some of them. Others speak the ancient tongue of the Britons, Brythonic. They bury their dead with old rites. Some carve crosses into temple walls. Others whisper to gods, even older than Rome. This place, Carlisle, Lugavalium, becomes a refuge, a holdout, a beacon. In a time when so many towns are abandoned, it becomes a gathering point, a knot in the fabric of a fraying world. And it is here, many believe, that the roots of the kingdom of Rithage begin to grow. We don't know who ruled at first. Maybe no one did. Perhaps it was a council of elders, perhaps a former military commander, left behind when the garrison pulled out. Perhaps a local aristocrat, descended from tribal nobility, but raised in the Roman way. Whoever it was, they held this place together. And as more people came, seeking safety, stability, continuity, the city adapted again. It fused what was left of Roman life with the older rhythms of the land. A hybrid world, not fully Roman, not fully native, something in between. There are signs of trade, still, pottery from Gaul, trinkets from the Irish Sea, inscriptions in worn Latin. Some even suggest contact with Byzantium, or at least echoes of its influence through long, slow trade routes. And through this quiet persistence, Carlisle becomes the heart of something new. The kingdom of Rithage, a name sung in bardic poetry for generations, a land of proud warriors and storied kings, of green valleys and long memory. This is not the story of collapse, it is the story of survival and transformation. In a land where cities fell silent, Carlisle whispered on, and if you walk its streets today, you'll find layers beneath the surface, Roman brick beneath medieval stone, ancient roads beneath modern ones, a city that remembers. So let your thoughts settle into this place. Feel the quiet persistence, feel the warmth of a hearth long gone cold, the echo of footsteps on a worn Roman street. The last city did not fall, it waited, and from it, a kingdom would rise. Ghosts in the Wall. Hadrian's Wall, a ribbon of stone stretching from coast to coast, across the wild back of northern Britain. In its prime it marked the edge of empire, the northern frontier of Roman rule, a marvel of engineering, a symbol of might. But by the time our story unfolds, the wall is quiet, the legions are long gone, the gates are unguarded, and yet life clings to it still. Forts like Burdoswald, Vindolanda, and Housesteads remain partly occupied. Families tend small plots where soldiers once trained, children play, where officers once barked commands. The great gates rust on their hinges, but inside these stone shells, the fires are still lit. Who were these people? Perhaps descendants of Roman soldiers, perhaps local Britons who found safety behind the walls. They patched roofs, dug wells, raised sheep and barley. Life didn't vanish. It changed, simplified, slowed. Archaeology gives us glimpses, post holes cut into Roman floors, hearths where there were once barracks, the bones of pigs, sheep and goats, jewelry of mixed styles, part Roman, part local. It was a time of transition. Some carved crosses into Roman stone, the first hints of a changing faith. Others kept older ways alive, We find evidence of votive offerings, bits of food, twisted metal, charms, old habits lingering, blending, and still the wall loomed, silent and strong, not a boundary anymore, but a memory, a road, a place where stories gathered. Bards would later sing of kings who rode its length, of watchmen who lit fires to warn of Saxon raids, of dreams seen in the mists beyond the wall. Perhaps none of it was true, or perhaps all of it was, in some form. For in these decades, the mid-5th to the early 6th century, memory becomes more powerful than record. The written word fades, older tradition thrives. History becomes story, and Hadrian's Wall becomes the spine of those stories. Even now, if you stand at Housesteads at twilight, you can feel it. The hush of time, the slow breath of the land, the stones beneath your feet. They've seen things, and they remember. To the south, in valleys and forests, kingdoms are forming. To the north, wild hills and ancient tribes. But here, along the wall, people survive. Quietly, unremarkably, heroically. This is not the story of great battles. It is the story of stubborn endurance, of those who refused to leave, who stayed in the skeleton of empire, and made it a home. Perhaps they sang the old songs. Perhaps they told their children of Rome, and gods, and duty. Or perhaps they simply mended roofs, and kept sheep. But here, among the ruins, something endured, not the empire, but its echo. The wall held more than stone. It held memory. And memory, in a dark age, is a kind of light. Yet these stone bones were more than ruins. They were anchors, for in the world beyond the wall, chaos often reigned. Saxon warbands pushing in from the east, Irish raiders coming from the western sea, Pictish clans drifting across the highlands. The people who remained near the wall, in its shadow, knew these threats. They lived with them, built lives beside them. Imagine a day in this world. Dawn breaks over the low hills. A farmer leads his animals through the morning mist, feet crunching on frost-covered grass. Children gather firewood in the ruins of a Roman watchtower. A mother tends to cooking, the smell of barley porridge rising in the cold air. Life continues, slow and deliberate, wrapped in a rhythm far older than any wall. Each generation forgets something the last one knew: how to write in Latin, how to carve marble, how to mix mortar for great walls. But they remember the songs, the old stories, how to watch the stars, how to tell when a storm is coming by the color of the sky. The memory of Rome begins to blur. For children born after the fall, the empire is a tale, a legend, something bards speak of, with wonder and disbelief. Once they might say, this land was ruled by men who built roads that never ended, by soldiers who came from lands so distant they didn't even speak our tongue. But when famine strikes, or wolves come too close, or a sickness sweeps through the hills, it is not the ghost of empire they turn to, it is each other. Community becomes survival, the ruins are shelter, the old wall, their compass. At night, near the hearth, elders might tell of the wall's building, of thousands of men laying stone day after day, of the strange rituals of the soldiers, of ghosts said to walk its length. Stories of courage, betrayal, and things that can't be named. Not just history, lore, myths forming in the vacuum, where empire once stood. And outside, always the wind that whistles through the empty forts, that moves over the grass like a whisper, that rustles the ancient stones. Hadrian's Wall, even now, seems to listen. So when you close your eyes, and let your thoughts drift, you might walk its length. You might stand where countless feet once marched, or where a lonely shepherd once looked out at the hills, and wondered what would come next. It's not about the battles that happened here, it's about the people who stayed. The last city of Rome. Far to the west of the wall, where the stone fortresses met the cold breath of the Irish Sea, there lies a place steeped in strange endurance, a city older than most others in Britain, where time itself seems to have slowed, lingering in the stone, caught between memory and mist. Carlisle, once known by a different name, Lugavalium, a name given when Rome still ruled the world. Unlike many of its Roman counterparts, Lugavalium did not fall into complete ruin. When the legions marched south for the last time, it lived on, people stayed. Lives were rebuilt in the shadow of ancient grandeur. The stones remained warm with habitation, their edges softened by centuries of wind, their mortar crumbling but not defeated. This place, it did not forget. Even after the Western Empire fractured and fell, Carlisle remained, not as a capital, or a mighty city, but as something rarer, a remnant, a memory that refused to die. You can imagine it, can't you? A small council of elders meeting in the twilight of Roman influence, keeping old customs alive by candlelight, children playing in the ruins of the bathhouses, unaware they were born into the embers of empire, traders arriving from distant coasts, still using the Roman roads that carried memories under every stone. And yet, this was not Rome, not anymore. The stone walls might remain, but the language was changing, Latin slowly giving way to something older, something British, Brythonic, the native tongue of the island. Carlisle was becoming something new, a bridge between what had been and what would come, a place where the Roman and the British mingled, not in conquest, but in quiet survival. In the hills and forts surrounding the city, other echoes of this hybrid world remained, places like Burdoswald, Vindolanda, and Housesteads. Roman forts, yes, but occupied well into the post-Roman age. Their rooms adapted, their walls patched with timber, their schedules no longer run by emperors, but by need. What did those people think, waking each day in the ruins of a fallen empire? Did they still consider themselves Romans, or had they already become something else entirely? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. We know from archaeology that many of these forts were reused, not just by squatters, but by organized communities. Some even continued to trade with the continent, faint traces of goods from far-off lands discovered among the debris. Others buried their dead in Roman fashion, but beside them, pagan symbols and native rites. It was a time of blending, of transitions, the end of one world, and the slow birth of another. Carlisle, for all its modesty today, was perhaps the last true Roman city in Britain. Its people walked Roman streets, lived in Roman buildings, worshipped in half-remembered Roman ways, long after the emperors were gone, and in doing so, they kept a light burning, a flicker of the old world. For generations to come, that flame would inspire others. It would flicker in the minds of kings and dreamers. Bards would sing of ancient glories, and rulers would claim descent from Rome. But the reality was different. This wasn't an empire anymore. It was a memory, and it was slowly, gently becoming something new. So as you rest, and let your breathing slow, picture the streets of ancient Carlisle. Hear the distant murmur of markets long gone. See the torches burning on crumbling walls, and know that even here, on the edge of the world, something endured. A city that remembered, a people who would not let go, a quiet corner of the world, where Rome lasted just a little bit longer. Sleep well, traveler, you are walking old roads now. Regauged, kingdom of mist and memory. Now we follow the mist deeper into the Old North, past Carlisle, past the silent forts, into the green, rain-fed valleys nestled beneath the shadow of the Cumbrian mountains. Here, where the land dips and folds like the pages of an ancient book, a kingdom once flourished, a name barely whispered now, but once known to all who dwelled between wall and wave. Regauged, a kingdom of the Britons, born in the ashes of Roman Britain, raised in the wild heart of the West. We know little of its borders. They shift and blur across the maps historians have tried to draw, but we know its soul, for it lives on in poetry, in fragments, in the songs of bards and the scratched letters of stone. Regauged was likely a stronghold of power centered in the Aden Valley and stretching to the Irish Sea. It was never vast, not like Rome, but it was proud. It had horses, warriors, hills to protect it, rivers to feed it, and above all else, it had leaders who fought for more than land. One name echoes loudest from that forgotten age: Urien, Urien of Regauged, warrior king, bardic hero, one of the last defenders of the old British order against the rising tide of Anglo-Saxon power. His name appears in the earliest surviving Welsh poetry, in elegies that mourn his fall, and in praise that sings of his deeds. Urien was no emperor, no distant ruler. He led his men into battle himself, sword drawn, shield raised, fighting not just for a kingdom, but for a way of life under threat, for a culture rapidly vanishing into mist. In the foggy woodlands and scattered settlements of Regauged, Urien fought and won many battles. The poems speak of cataclysmic clashes at places with names that have since faded: Gwen Eustrad, each battle slowing the advance of the Anglian tide. These were not battles of grand armies, not great fields lined with banners. They were skirmishes, ambushes, brutal and intimate, warriors grappling in the mud, steel flashing in the twilight, and cries echoing through the trees. And in every tale, Urien stands at the center, fierce, unyielding, determined to hold back the dark. But glory does not guard against betrayal. In the end, Urien was murdered, not by a foreign enemy, but by one of his own. a rival British lord, a reminder that unity was rare in those times, and fatal disunity, all too common. Regade would not last long after him. The kingdom faded, absorbed, forgotten, but not lost. Its memory persisted in the hills, in place names, in the whisper of sheepfold winds and the rhythm of water down old stone wells, and the poems remained. The Welsh bard Taliesin, perhaps real, perhaps a name worn by many, spoke of Urien as more than a man, as a storm, as a breaker of foes, a king wrapped in myth and marrow. Even today, when you wander the Cumbrian fells, when the clouds descend and the mist swallows the hills, it is not hard to imagine Urien's warriors moving quietly among the stone, their firelight flickering behind crags, their voices lost in the rain. They are gone, but their echoes are not. The kings of Regade, like their kingdom, have become legend. But beneath the legend lies a truth, that this land, wild and green and untamed, was once the heart of a world now forgotten, a world where poetry and battle walked hand in hand, where a king could be made not by birth, but by his courage, his words, and the loyalty of his few. In the darkness, let your thoughts drift to that valley, the one no map can mark. Let the steady patter of rain on leaves, and the rustle of the wind in the grass guide your mind away from today. Regade was never meant to be remembered in textbooks. It was sung, not taught. It lived, not lasted. And tonight it lives again in you. So close your eyes, feel the soft earth of the old north beneath you, hear the faint clash of blade and breath, the distant call of the bards. This is Regade, a dream of the Britons, held together by will, lost to time but not to memory. Sleep well, listener. The old kings ride tonight, in stories that will never truly end. The forgotten forts, and the lingering wall. As we leave the echo of Reged behind, we turn east, where stone lingers longer than stories, and the shape of empire can still be traced beneath your feet. This is the land of the Wall, Hadrian's Wall, a monument of staggering ambition, a line drawn across the island by the Roman Empire nearly 2,000 years ago, not to end the world, but to mark it, to declare this is where we end, and beyond lies something else entirely. Even in ruins, it commands the eye. It snakes across hills and river valleys, a line of ancient strength. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, after the Roman legions had long since marched away, parts of this wall were not ruins. They were homes. Forts once manned by imperial troops now housed local warlords and their retinues. Roman storehouses became stables, bathhouses repurposed as meeting halls. At Burdaswald, Vindolanda, and Housesteads, archaeological evidence shows life continuing well after Rome's withdrawal. But what kind of life? Was it Roman still, or something older? Did they speak Latin in these forts? Did they wear Roman tunics, light oil lamps, and read from fading scrolls, or had they already turned back to older tongues, Brythonic perhaps, and to older gods? We cannot know for certain, but we can imagine, and the remnants speak to us. Post holes cut into former granaries, new timber buildings atop old stone, the signs of adaptation, survival, people making do in the shadows of a fallen empire. In many places, the wall was no longer a barrier. It became a spine, a landmark to cling to. Communities formed near it, farmers reused its stone, roads followed its course, and memories nestled in its crumbling towers. To the people of the Old North, the wall may not have been a frontier between civilization and barbarism, as Rome had once claimed. Instead, it became a reminder, a marker of what once was, and perhaps of what could be again. These forts, now garrisoned by local elites, might have functioned as small kingdoms unto themselves. A commander becomes a chieftain, a steward becomes a king, their power no longer flowing from Rome, but from land, loyalty, and lineage. There are whispers of a figure, Cole Hen, Old King Cole. He's remembered as in nursery rhyme, but in some traditions he was a powerful British warlord who held sway in these northern regions after Rome's collapse. Some even suggest he was based at Eboracum, York, commanding the wall and the land around it. We cannot say what is legend and what is history, but that is the charm of the Old North. It doesn't hand you a story, it offers you fragments, inviting your mind to wander and your imagination to fill the rest. If you ever walk along Hadrian's Wall, you'll notice something strange. It feels both ancient and alive. Wind whispers through the cracks, moss clings to every stone, and sometimes when the mist rolls over the hilltops, the wall itself seems to breathe. Pause a moment there, look out over the wide northern sky. the same sky watched by Roman legionaries, by post-Roman chieftains, and perhaps even by Urian's descendants. Time folds here, and if you let yourself drift, you may just feel it unfold. Close your eyes, let the old stones speak, and let the wall, that mighty spine of empire, carry you into sleep. Shadows over Elmet. Now we drift south, where the hills soften and the air carries a different scent of oaks, slow rivers, and buried memory. Here, in what is now Yorkshire, a different kind of kingdom stirred after Rome had gone quiet. Its name was Elmet. Elmet was never a vast realm. It was small, nestled among the woods and hills east of the Pennines. But it was a survivor. In the tangled landscape of early medieval Britain, survival was a kind of victory. Elmet's people spoke a Brittonic tongue, cousins of those in Wales and the Hen Ogledd. They were farmers, warriors, and poets. We know so little, and yet we know enough to be haunted. Archaeological evidence is thin, a handful of graves, bits of jewelry, lingering place names, Barwick in Elmet, Sherburn in Elmet, echoes. But the real shadow of Elmet falls in verse. From the lips of a bard named Heled, or perhaps someone speaking in her voice, we hear lamentation. In the poem Canu Heled, she weeps for the fall of her kin. For a court once filled with music and firelight, now gone, burned, ravaged. She names cities we cannot place. She mourns kings we barely remember. But the ache in her voice is unmistakable. This was a world that lived, and then died. Some say Elmet was a vassal to Reged, others that it stood alone. What is clear is that it resisted. For a time, the tide of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms growing to the east, the Angles of Deira and Bernicia were pushing westward, slowly consuming the heartlands of Brittonic Britain, and Elmet stood in their path. One name rises from the haze, Ceredig, a king of Elmet. We know him only through the writings of Bede, the Anglo-Saxon monk and historian, who speaks of Elmet's fall. It was the early 7th century. Edwin, king of Northumbria, sought to claim the region. Ceredig was accused of treachery, of offering sanctuary to Edwin's enemies, a justification perhaps for conquest. And so Elmet fell. The woods were silenced, the bards scattered, and the last of its kings faded into legend. But Elmet leaves behind more than just ruins and laments. It reminds us that history is made of the small and the local, of kingdoms that may not have conquered, but which endured, for a while, enough to shape lives, raise halls, and be missed. When you walk through modern Yorkshire, you may see nothing of Elmet, but beneath the ploughed fields, beneath the suburban streets, its soil still holds the memory, a shard of pottery, a buried brooch, a name on a weathered map. And sometimes, at night, if you listen through the wind, you may still hear a woman's voice, soft, grieving, singing of her fallen brothers and her ruined land. This is Elmet, a shadow kingdom, lost in the folds of time, but not forgotten, not here, not tonight. Let's linger for a moment on the landscape Elmet called home, not the grand geography of borders and wars, but the intimate geography of daily life. Imagine small enclosures nestled in wooded glades, timber halls lit by firelight, and quiet ridges from which smoke rose gently in the morning mist. People here would have lived simply, but not without richness. Stories, songs, and lineage held power. Honor was currency, kinship was protection, and even as greater forces loomed at the edges, it was the land that held them, shaped them. Think of a child growing up in Elmet, a child who'd never seen a Roman road, only heard of one. Their stories would be of trees that whispered, springs that healed, and hills that hid the bones of giants. They would not speak Latin, but the language of their ancestors, and when they asked where their people came from, they'd be told, from this land, always from this land. Such identities ran deep, and when they were threatened, resistance was fierce. Not always open warfare, but memory became rebellion, culture became defiance. Even the way Elmet fell tells us something. It was not crushed in a single stroke, but swallowed, slowly, by the expanding reach of Northumbria, as if the dark was overtaken by the dawn, but quietly, and not without mourning. The bardic laments like Canu Heled may not have been composed in Elmet itself. They could be echoes from a neighboring kingdom, but their themes match too closely to ignore the aching loss of a home that is no more. And it's worth remembering this: the victors may write the chronicles, but the defeated often write the poetry. Elmet lives on in that way. As long as there are ears to hear sorrow turned into song, it survives. We walk now in places that were once filled with memory. The ruins have faded, but memory still walks beside us. Let your thoughts wander gently now, past the fields and the hedgerows, through that older wood, and into a time when kingdoms could be held together by oaths and old names. Elmet may be gone from the maps, but not from the story, not from this one. The Shadow Roads, settle in now. Let the quiet take hold. The night has drawn its curtain across the land, and we return again to the wild borderlands of the Old North. Here, in the dim ages that followed Rome's retreat, something curious lingers just beneath the moss and earth. Not just ruins, not just names, but paths, old ones, secret ones, forgotten by most, but never truly gone. The people of the Old North called them Shadow Roads. Whispers say they were used by warbands under moonlight, moving silently between hill and vale, tracks hidden from sight, following the creases of the land, the bones of the earth. Their existence was never written down, and yet they are real. If you were to trace them now, perhaps you'd begin in the quiet hills of Cumbria, where the grass grows thick between standing stones, or farther east, along the old Roman way that once connected the empire's northern edge. From there they splintered into the fells and forests, threading through glens and ancient fords. In the centuries after Rome's departure, these paths became arteries of power. Small kings, scarcely more than chieftains, relied on them to hold what little land they had. Their knowledge passed from father to son, guide to guide, no maps, just memory. And the ones who truly knew these shadow roads, they were rarely kings or nobles, they were the hidden ones. Traders, poets, scouts, story keepers. Some of the earliest tales from this land speak of messengers riding alone through storm and frost, bearing word of battle or alliance. These riders had no insignia, no banners, but their memory remains. Perhaps they rode by starlight, perhaps the wind whispered to them, and perhaps some say they were protected by more than just cunning and caution. You see, the Old North was a place where the real and the imagined lived side by side. The forest had its rules, the land had its stories, and the people had their beliefs, old ones, wild ones. A tree might be older than a bloodline, a hill might remember every name it was ever given. So to move safely across these lands required more than knowing where to walk. You had to know when to speak, when to stay silent, when to leave an offering in a stone circle, or whisper a name into the mist. It is said that the best guides would carry not just a blade, but a bundle of heather, a carved token, a shard of bone from a long-dead ancestor. Protection, they believed, against what couldn't be seen. And so these shadow roads became more than just ways to travel. They were lifelines, threads connecting not just places but people. Traders brought not only goods but gossip. Poets carried stories from valley to valley, their words weaving a web of memory across the land. Over time, many of these roads faded. Forests reclaimed some, rivers shifted, cutting off others, and yet, echoes remain. An unusually straight track through the hills, a hollow way that never seems to flood, a line of stones hidden beneath a sheep path. And in some places, even today, you may find yourself walking one of these old paths without ever realizing it, until a sudden breeze rises where there should be none, or a bird stops singing, or you feel, not watched but remembered. These are not stories of great battles or kings with crowns, but they are just as vital to the world that once was, because the Old North was more than war. It was movement, connection, survival through knowing the land better than your enemy ever could. So if you lie back now, close your eyes and drift further into the hush of this forgotten age, know that you are walking one of those roads, slowly, carefully, listening to the wind, feeling the earth. Let the story carry you, let the land remember you. This was the chapter of the Shadow Roads, and you are not alone upon them. The forgotten kingdoms, lost in the mist. The mists of time have a way of erasing the past. What was once known becomes myth. What was once solid turns to fog. And yet some stories refuse to fade entirely, no matter how far back they stretch. There was a time, in the long, slow years after the Romans had gone, when Britain was a land of shifting borders, where kingdoms were born, fought for, and disappeared as quietly as the dusk. After the Romans departed, Britain was no longer a unified land. The mighty legions were gone, leaving only the ruins of cities and roads, once built to conquer and control, now abandoned to the slow pull of nature. It was a land teetering between the ancient and the unknown, and from this forgotten world, new kingdoms emerged. Kingdoms that, in many ways, existed in the shadow of the empire that had once stretched across the entire island. Among them were the kingdoms of the Old North, names that survive in whispers, kingdoms that rose in the wake of Roman Britain, scattered across the lands of what is now northern England and southern Scotland, and though many of these kingdoms have been lost to time, their echoes still linger in the hills, the valleys, and the songs of the land. Take Elmet, for example. It's one of those kingdoms that almost seems to have fallen through the cracks of history. Situated in the misty hills of what is now West Yorkshire, Elmet was one of the last strongholds of the ancient Britons, holding on to its independence long after the Romans left. Elmet wasn't a kingdom in the conventional sense, not with a grand capital or a formal system of rule. Instead, it was a collection of small chiefs and local leaders, each one fiercely protective of their own stretch of land. The hills of Elmet were wild and rugged, filled with forests and valleys where settlements were scattered like forgotten ruins. It was here, in the shadow of Hadrian's Wall, that the last remnants of Roman influence began to fade. The Roman roads had been built, stretching like veins through the land, but the people of Elmet didn't need the roads anymore. They walked the paths that had always been there, winding, ancient and barely touched by the hand of empire. Their homes were simple, built of wood and stone, tucked into the folds of the land, hidden from the sight of the world. But it was this land, wild and untamed, that would become the heart of the Old North. Elmet was unique in that it held out for a time against the Saxon invasion, the relentless push of the Anglo-Saxons to carve up Britain into their own kingdoms. While the Saxons moved south, sweeping through the lands of the Britons, Elmet remained. For a while, it stood as one of the last bastions of the old ways, and yet, like so many kingdoms in the Old North, it couldn't survive forever. By the 7th century, the Saxons had finally worn down the last defences of Elmet, and the kingdom fell. But even in its fall, Elmet's spirit remained, because what survived was not the kingdom itself, but the story. The name Elmet was passed down through generations, like a haunting refrain. The land, with its hills and valleys, held its memory, and even today, the wind whispers through the trees, as if calling out to those who once lived there. But Elmet is not the only forgotten kingdom in the Old North. There were many others. Reged, for instance, to the north, a land of rolling hills and fertile valleys, where the River Eden carved its way through the countryside. Reged was once a powerful kingdom, a place where kings ruled over vast territories and their warriors fought fiercely to protect their lands. Reged's kings were warriors, yes, but also poets, storytellers, and keepers of the old ways. It is from Reged that one of the most legendary figures of the Old North arose, Urien, a king whose name has echoed through the centuries. Urien, like so many kings of the Old North, fought not only for land, but for the preservation of the old ways. For a time his kingdom stood against the might of the Anglo-Saxon invaders, holding back their advance into the heart of the Britain's world. Urien's story has been passed down through the bardic tradition, sung in the halls of Welsh kings, and in the hearts of those who still remember the days when Reged stood proud and free. But even as Reged and Elmet fought to preserve their identities, the winds of change were sweeping through the land. The rise of the Saxons was inevitable. It was a slow, steady conquest, a cultural shift that would reshape Britain. And yet, even as the Old North began to fade, its people held on to what they could. There were other kingdoms too, small, scattered and often forgotten by history. Godden, a kingdom that stretched into what is now Scotland, stood at the edge of the world, its warriors fighting against invaders from every direction. Strathclyde, another northern kingdom, nestled between hills and rivers, clinging to life as the Romans and later the Saxons faded into legend. Each one, a shadow of something once larger, each one, a small flicker of light in the endless darkness that followed the fall of Rome. In the centuries to come, these kingdoms would become the stuff of legend. Their names would be passed down in songs sung by firelight, their battles remembered in the tales of wandering bards. But in the days they lived, they were simply people who had inherited a broken world and tried to put it back together. Yet these kingdoms were never truly gone. For though the Saxons ruled the south, the northern lands held a different identity, a Brittonic identity, a connection to the ancient world that had been swept away in the tides of empire. And it's in the heart of the Old North, among the ruins of its kingdoms, that we find the true spirit of what came before. The spirit of the Old North, echoes of a lost world. As the mist weaves its way through the hills, there are places in the Old North where the veil between time and memory grows thin. If you stand quietly, your feet resting on the stones of ancient settlements, you may find yourself listening to the land itself. The wind, carrying the faintest echo of a battle cry, might whisper the name of a long-forgotten king. The earth, cracked and broken, may reveal the shadow of an old fort, its ramparts now crumbled to dust. It is in these quiet places, far removed from the noise of the world, that the true spirit of the Old North lives on. This land, so familiar, and yet so strange, speaks in its own language. Its hills, steep and rugged, are not just geographical features, they are markers of ancient borders, remnants of old kingdoms that once stretched across the land. Their people, fierce and proud, lived in a time of constant change and upheaval. They saw the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of cultures, and the fading of the empire that once held sway over Britain. The Romans came and went, leaving behind a landscape marked by their roads, their cities, and their fortifications. But the true heart of the Old North was not Roman. It was something older, something more primal. The Britons, the ancient people of these lands, carried with them the memory of their ancestors, a connection to a world that had long since vanished beneath the shadow of empire. And as the Roman world fell, so too did the stability that it once provided. The roads, once bustling with the movement of legions, began to crumble. The cities that had thrived under Roman rule were abandoned. The great stone walls that once protected Roman citizens from invaders fell into ruin. It was a landscape caught between two worlds, one fading into memory, the other struggling to take its place. In this time of transition, the kingdoms of the Old North emerged. These were not great empires, not the grand kingdoms of kings with vast armies and shining capitals. No, the kingdoms of the Old North were more like fragile whispers in the wind. They were smaller, often isolated, bound together by nothing more than a shared history and the land that held them. Kingdoms like Rigid, Elmet, Strathclyde, and Godden rose out of the ashes of the Roman world, each one struggling to hold on to something that the world seemed determined to erase. But despite their fragile beginnings, these kingdoms were not without power. They had their warriors, their bards, and their kings, and they had the land itself, a land that seemed to have the power to shape men's fates. For in the Old North, the land was not just a place to live, it was a force to be reckoned with. The hills of Rigid, for example, were more than just a backdrop to the kingdom's struggles, they were a fortress. The people who lived there knew the land as only those who had lived with it for generations could. They knew the hidden valleys, the secret paths through the hills, the places where the wind carried the scent of battle long before it arrived. The hills were both protection and prison. The people of Rigid were never truly safe, but the land provided them with the means to survive. In the kingdom of Elmet, the ancient forests were the very bones of the land. The people there lived in harmony with the trees, the rivers, and the rocks. Their lives were shaped by the natural world in ways that the Romans had never understood. And when the Saxons came, sweeping through the land with their axes and swords, the people of Elmet fought not just for their homes, but for the very spirit of the land that had nurtured them for so long. As these kingdoms fought to survive, they were not alone. Other powers, other forces were at play. The Saxons to the south, the Picts to the north, and the Irish to the west, all had their designs on the land of the Old North. The winds of political change blew fierce, and the kingdoms of the north were caught in the whirlwind. But in every battle, in every skirmish, the people of the Old North fought not just for survival, but for their heritage, for the land that had shaped them. And it is in these quiet, forgotten places that the true history of the Old North lives. Not in the grand tales of kings and warriors, but in the subtle shifts of the landscape, in the stone walls that rise from the earth, half hidden by the moss and the wind, in the silent valleys that once saw the march of armies, now forgotten by all but the wind and the rain. The Old North is not a place that can be easily defined. It is not a land of simple borders or clear-cut histories. It is a land of echoes, a land where the past and present merge into something that cannot be fully grasped. The kingdoms that once ruled here were not just political entities. They were born from the land itself, from the very earth beneath their feet. As you sit, listening to the wind, you may hear the faintest whisper of the past, the cry of a warrior, the call of a king, the song of a bard. These are not just the memories of old kingdoms, they are the spirits of a world that existed long before ours, a world that is still alive in the land itself. The Old North is not gone, it lives on, quietly, in the hills, the forests, and the rivers, and if you listen carefully, you may still hear it calling to you. The warriors of the Old North, kings, clans, and the warbands, in the shadow of the hills and beneath the canopy of ancient forests, the people of the Old North lived a life shaped by the rhythm of the land. Their days were marked not by the ringing of church bells or the passing of time on a clock, but by the changing of the seasons, the whispering of the wind and the pulse of the earth beneath their feet. The warriors of the Old North were not the polished knights of legend, shining in armor and bearing gleaming swords. They were something else entirely, rough-hewn, wild, and fiercely independent. They were men and women who knew the land better than their own blood. warriors born of the soil itself. These were not the kings and lords of distant courts. No, these were the leaders of warbands, the chieftains of clans. Their power was not measured in the number of castles they ruled, or the wealth they accumulated. It was measured in the loyalty of their followers, the sharpness of their swords, and the ferocity of their hearts. The old ways of the warrior were ingrained in their culture. Honor and strength were everything, and to be a warrior in the Old North was not simply about fighting. It was about belonging to something greater than oneself, a clan, a kingdom, or a cause. For in the land where the wind howls through the hills and the rain falls in sheets, survival was a communal effort. The people fought for their homes, for their families, and for the land itself. The names of the kings of the Old North may be lost to time, but their legacies live on in the warriors they led. These kings were not distant figures on a throne, but leaders who fought alongside their people, who shared in the hardships of the land. They were not crowned in gold or seated in grand halls, but were chosen for their strength in battle, their ability to lead, and their bond with the land. One such warrior king was Rhydurch Hale, a leader of Gododin, whose deeds were sung by bards long after his death. He was a king not because he wore a crown, but because he fought at the head of his people. His warriors followed him not out of fear, but out of respect. They knew that he would stand with them in the fight, that he would share their burdens and shoulder their pain. In battle he was as relentless as the storms that battered the hills. And then there was Connida, the founder of the kingdom of Gwyndend in the west, a warrior whose blood was said to be as fierce as the land he ruled. His men followed him because they knew no one could outmatch his cunning and strength. But even more than that, they followed him because he was one of them, a son of the Old North, born from the land, destined to lead his people into battle and to victory. These warriors were not alone in their struggles. In the heart of the Old North, the battle between the Britons and the Saxons raged on. The Saxons, fierce and determined, were sweeping through the land, carving out kingdoms of their own. The people of the Old North, proud and defiant, refused to yield. They fought not just for survival, but for their very identity, for the memory of the world before the Romans, for the legends of their ancestors, for the land that had always been theirs. It was a brutal, unrelenting war. The Saxons, driven by their gods and their own ambitions, were determined to conquer the Old North. They brought with them their own brand of warfare, their own gods, their own way of life. The people of the Old North, however, were no strangers to conflict. They had faced invaders before, the Romans, the Picts, and now the Saxons, and each time they had held their ground. But this time was different. The Saxons were not just warriors, they were settlers, bringing with them their families, their farms, and their villages. They sought not only to conquer the land, but to settle it, and this was something the people of the Old North could not ignore. The battle for the land was no longer just about fighting armies, it was about preserving a way of life. In the kingdom of Strathclyde, the resistance to Saxon invasion was fierce. The warriors there fought not just for their homes, but for the very soul of the Old North. They knew that if the Saxons succeeded, the land would be lost forever. The hills would no longer echo with the songs of their ancestors. The forests would no longer shelter their warriors. The rivers would no longer carry the memory of their kings. But despite their fierce resistance, the Saxons pressed on. They were relentless, and as the years passed, they began to wear down the defenses of the Old North. The battle became less about battlefields and more about survival. The warriors of the Old North were forced to retreat into the hills, into the forests, into the very land that had once been their strength. In the end, it was not just the warriors who fought for the Old North. It was the people, the farmers, the bards, the blacksmiths, the wives and children. They were the ones who kept the memory of their kings alive, who passed down the stories of their battles, who sang the songs that would never fade from the land. The warbands of the Old North were not just made up of warriors, they were made up of families, of communities, of people, bound together by a shared history and a shared land. And even as the Saxons pressed on, even as the kingdoms of the Old North fell one by one, the spirit of those who fought for the land remained strong. As the wind howls through the hills of the Old North, it carries with it the stories of these warriors. The warriors who fought not just for land, but for the soul of a people, for a culture that refused to die. Their battle cries still echo in the hills, their blood still stains the earth, and their legacy lives on in the spirit of the land. For in the end, the Old North was never just a place, it was a people, a memory, a spirit that could never be extinguished. And even as the world moved on, even as empires rose and fell, the warriors of the Old North remained, quietly waiting, whispering their stories to the wind. Hill forts and hidden strongholds, life behind the walls. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the wind howling through the heather, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke lingering in the crisp northern air. You're standing atop a lonely hill, one that's been shaped not by nature alone, but by human hands. Beneath your feet lie the buried remains of timber palisades and stone foundations, the forgotten edges of a world once fiercely defended. This is a hill fort. Not the grand castles of later medieval kings, but something older, raw, more intimate. These were the citadels of the Old North, strongholds built into ridgelines, protected by ditches, earthworks, and the brutal advantage of height. From here, warbands could watch the valleys below. They could spot movement across the moors and decide whether to meet it with trade or with blades. In a land where law was flexible and alliances could turn with the season, a stronghold meant survival. But these weren't just military sites. Hill forts were homes, communities, places of gathering and ceremony, defense and daily life. Children played inside wooden stockades. Fires burned low under smoke-darkened rafters. Chickens scratched at the dirt beside sharpening stones and buried storage pits. Life behind the walls was harsh, but it was also deeply rooted in the landscape. Many of these forts, like Traprain Law in Lothian or Dumbarton Rock, the seat of Alt Clut, had been in use for generations, some long before the Romans ever came. Their designs were adapted over centuries, growing with the needs of the people who lived inside them. And when Rome fell, many of these places took on new life. Refugees from fallen towns, displaced nobility, survivors of war, they all looked to the old high places for safety. You can still see them if you know where to look. Lumps in the ground, overgrown embankments, rings of stone hidden beneath ferns and bramble. Each one tells a story of fear, of hope, of stubborn persistence. And though few hill forts were permanent homes in the strictest sense, people often moved between seasonal sites. They served as vital anchors in the unpredictable world of the 5th and 6th centuries. A hill fort gave you somewhere to fall back to, a high place to light a signal fire, a stronghold to gather your kin when raiders came through the glen. And make no mistake, they did come. The collapse of Roman authority didn't bring peace. If anything, it made the landscape more dangerous. Saxon raiders from the east, Irish sea kings from the west, Pictish tribes from the far north, all carved their paths through the fragmented remains of Britain's old provinces. Inside the hill forts, strategies were whispered, alliances were made, oaths were sworn by torchlight. Sometimes, rival kings would meet face to face, not in battle, but in parley. These strongholds became political centers, not the great walled cities of old, but more intimate halls of power. Here, decisions were made that shaped the fate of the Old North. And then there were the stories, the legends whispered over fires, about the heroes who once defended these hills, about the glimmering warriors who rode out against impossible odds, and the queens who ruled with quiet strength. Bardic memory was long. It remembered the shape of a fortress, even after its stones had crumbled. Today, archaeologists still find bits of that life, a fragment of pottery here, an iron brooch there, and sometimes, deep beneath the soil, the charred remains of firewood, a spearhead still buried in the ash, traces of a battle, or maybe a siege that ended in silence. What's fascinating is how these places remain sacred, even after their time, as fortresses ended. Centuries later, churches were often built within their ruins. Early Christian missionaries chose the old high places, maybe because the people still gathered there, maybe because they were seen as thresholds between worlds, between the sacred and the profane, the old gods and the new. It's easy to think of the past as far away, but in these hill forts, the layers of time press close together. Roman-era coins sit beside post-Roman weaponry. Pagan shrines are later turned into altars. Old gods become saints. The fort becomes the village. The village becomes a ruin. But the spirit of those strongholds never truly faded. Even today, if you stand at the top of one of these hills and feel the wind tug at your sleeves, you may sense it. A presence, a quiet vigilance. The land remembers what we forget. This was the backbone of the Old North. Not just kings or warriors, but communities built around strength, memory, and the will to endure. These hill forts were never just places of war, they were homes. Into the mist, the lost kings of Elmet? Breathe in slowly, and imagine waking to a world without boundaries. No England, no Scotland, no fixed borders drawn on maps, just hills and rivers, forests and moors, and people carving out lives in whatever space they could defend. Somewhere in the heart of that misty middle ground, between the ridgelines of what we now call Yorkshire and the damp valleys that cradle the River Aire, there once was a kingdom, a forgotten kingdom. They called it Elmet, It doesn't appear in many modern histories. You won't find it in textbooks, and there are no great monuments left standing. And yet, in the centuries after Rome's fall, Elmet was real, a small but stubborn pocket of Brittonic resistance, holding firm while Germanic kingdoms rose all around it. To its west, the vast Pennine Hills. To its east, the swelling tide of Anglo-Saxon settlers. And in between, a people clinging to identity, to language, and to the memory of older native ways. We don't know who founded Elmet. No epic tales tell of its first king, but we do know it endured well into the 7th century, a thread of continuity from Roman Britain into the Middle Ages. In a world splintering into chaos, Elmet survived longer than many. Its capital was likely in the region of modern-day Leeds, a place once known as Loidis. The same root survives in the name today, and nearby, on ridges and hilltops, there are faint traces of ancient settlements, earthworks half swallowed by grass and centuries. What we do have is a name, Cerdig, king of Elmet. Mentioned briefly in Bede's history, he's remembered not for great deeds, but for exile, expelled from his homeland when the powerful kingdom of Northumbria finally swept down and annexed Elmet in the early 7th century. He fled to Gwynedd, in northwest Wales, and there, the line of Elmet seems to end, but not quite, because something of Elmet lingered. In Welsh poetry, Elmet is remembered not just as a place, but as a symbol, a lost land, a last light. One 9th century poem, the Gododin, written far to the north, speaks of warriors from Elmet, who rode to war, alongside the men of Reged and the kingdom of the Votadini. Their names are barely legible now, but their memory is stitched into the song. And then there's the land itself. Elmet was known for its woods, dense, untouched forests, the kind of place where rebels could hide, where kings could vanish, and still hope to return. Even centuries later, the region around Sherwood and Barnsdale would echo with stories of outlaw kings, lurking in the trees, waiting for their moment. Perhaps those stories are older than we think. Perhaps they go back to Elmet, back to a world where a British kingdom held on, fiercely, quietly, in a sea of change, where a king could be born in a hill fort, fight wars on horseback, and still vanish into the trees when the tide turned. What made Elmet unique wasn't its power or its reach, it was its resistance. For over a century after Roman Britain had crumbled, Elmet remained, a pocket of the old world, a whisper of what once was. And if you find yourself walking the woodlands of West Yorkshire, listen carefully to the wind in the trees, it might still be whispering their names. The forest and the flame, memory and myth in the kingdom of Godden. Let the world around you slow down, settle into the quiet, and let your mind drift. Not backward but sideways, into a time half remembered. Into a land that was never quite one thing or another. Not yet England, not yet Scotland, and never truly Rome. It is the land of the Godden. The name sounds strange to modern ears. It's a ghost on the tongue, a breath of something ancient. But once, in the time after Rome, the kingdom of Godden stood proudly on the wind-blown ridges of what is now southeastern Scotland and northeast England, a land of cliffs and sea spray, hill forts and harbours. Its people were descended from the Votadini, one of the older tribes that had once lived under Roman rule. When the legions withdrew, they stayed, adapting, surviving, becoming something new, yet clinging still to their own identity. A fusion of old British ways and whatever was needed to survive. At the heart of their story is a single, legendary poem. Written in Old Welsh, long after the kingdom had passed into memory, it is known simply as Y Godden. It tells of a feast, a gathering of warriors, 300 of them, who drank together, laughed together, and then rode south to their deaths. They marched to Cattraeth, a place still debated by historians. Some say it was modern-day Catterick, in North Yorkshire. Others suggest it may have been somewhere else entirely. But wherever it was, the battle was real, and the warriors of Godden were all but wiped out. The poem is haunting, not a war cry, but a lament. It doesn't glorify the fight, it mourns it, and in doing so, it preserves something almost no other source from this age does. A human moment, a time of sorrow, of bravery, of loss. Some have compared it to the Greek Iliad, not in scale, but in spirit. It captures the same sense of doomed heroism, of men who knew they might die, and chose to ride anyway. It may even contain one of the first references to Arthur, not as a king, but as a comparison. One fallen warrior, it says, was no Arthur, which may mean that even by then, Arthur was a legendary figure, a gold standard for courage. But the poem also hints at something else, the fragility of the Old North. Godden was not a mighty empire, it was a fragile flame, flickering in the wind. Its warriors were fierce, but few. Its enemies, the rising Anglo-Saxon powers, were relentless, and though it survived for generations, eventually the tide overwhelmed it. By the 7th century, its lands had been folded into the new kingdom of Northumbria, its people absorbed, its forts abandoned, and yet, the poem remains. Ye Godden is one of the oldest surviving pieces of British literature, carried from tongue to tongue, later written down in medieval Wales. It preserves the memory of a kingdom that refused to be forgotten, a reminder that sometimes, words endure where walls fall, that in the end, memory matters. So as you drift deeper into the quiet now, imagine the wind sweeping across the coastal cliffs near Edinburgh. Imagine the echoes of hooves and steel. Imagine a bard, seated by the fire, remembering his lost companions in the only way he can, by singing them back to life. The Godden may be gone, but their voices still speak. The twilight of Elmet, a kingdom in the mist. Close your eyes, let your thoughts drift, as if carried by the soft winds that pass over damp green hills. And picture this, a quiet land, shrouded in morning fog. Trees stand still in the hush of dawn. The world feels unspoiled, timeless. You are standing in what was once the ancient British kingdom of Elmet. Few today even recognize the name, and yet, centuries ago, this gentle forested land, nestled between the rising Anglian kingdoms of Deira and Mercia, was home to a people who remembered the old ways. A quiet kingdom, perhaps, but not a forgettable one. Let your mind wander down over the rolling hills of what is now West Yorkshire. Imagine the streams, the woodland paths, the steep ridges and narrow valleys, all once dotted with hill forts, farmsteads and monasteries. This was Elmet, a place of borderlands and of deep-rooted memory. It was small, no glittering capital, no grand military victories recorded in parchment scrolls, but it was steady. It endured, long after other British kingdoms had vanished or been absorbed. The world around Elmet was changing. To the east, the Anglian kingdom of Deira, born from Germanic migration and conquest, was growing strong. To the south and west, Mercia, the ambitious kingdom of the Midlands, was already casting its eyes outward, and all across the land, Christianity was beginning to spread, replacing old gods with new faith, and in between, sat Elmet. The historian Bede mentions it only briefly, a sliver of a memory in his otherwise Anglian-focused telling. But from that small mention, and from Welsh poetry, and from place names still echoing in the landscape, we begin to see a picture forming. Elmet, we believe, was one of the last surviving Brittonic polities in eastern Britain, a holdout of the old culture, speaking the native tongue, keeping old traditions alive in a world that was fast becoming something else. The people of Elmet would have lived lives both simple and sacred, farming the land, worshipping in wooden churches or older sacred groves, living close to memory, carving stone crosses that still lie buried in earth or tucked into forgotten corners of ancient churches. We hear whispers of a ruler, Cerdig, possibly the last king of Elmet, a man caught in the storm of politics, religion, and survival. When Edwin of Northumbria invaded around 616 AD, Cerdig is said to have been exiled, perhaps fleeing westward toward the shelter of the Welsh kingdoms. Elmet did not fall with a crash, it faded. Its people weren't destroyed, they were absorbed, intermarried, baptized, changed. The hills stayed the same, but the language shifted, the gods changed, the names faded from memory. Yet look closely, and Elmet never truly disappeared. The place names still hold the clues. In Aberford, you'll find the Celtic prefix, Aby, meaning confluence of waters. In Sherborne in Elmet, the name still carries the ghost of the Old Kingdom. In the valleys, the ruins of ancient religious sites lie hidden beneath newer foundations, and in the early Christian stonework of Yorkshire churches, you might find carvings and inscriptions with distinct Celtic influence, not Anglian, not Roman, but something older. Elmet lives, quietly, in stone and soil. It is remembered in the Welsh bardic tradition too, praised as a land of devout people, of scholars and monks, and of steadfast identity. Unlike other kingdoms of the Hen Ogledd, like Rheged or Gododin, Elmet didn't leave us long poems of heroic battles or doomed warbands. Its legacy is subtler, a quiet persistence, a refusal to vanish. Some scholars believe that Elmet retained Christian practices long before its neighbors. There may have been monastic centers, perhaps small, wooden chapels tucked beside streams, run by local lords who balanced the roles of warrior, priest, and landholder. Imagine it now, a flickering candle in a thatched church, the wind howling outside, a scribe bent over his manuscript, copying prayers onto sheepskin, and outside farmers tilling the same land their ancestors had for centuries, unaware that their way of life was slipping into shadow. By the 7th century, Elmet was gone, but in many ways it survived in the spirit of its people, in the land that shaped them, in the language passed down through place names and family memory, and in the sense of being other, not quite Saxon, not quite Roman, but something rooted and unique. And so as the night deepens and your thoughts begin to soften, imagine walking through those valleys. The mossy stones beneath your feet once lined the paths of Elmet. The wind brushing the trees once stirred the cloaks of its kings and its monks. The rivers flowed then as they do now, quietly carrying the memory of a forgotten kingdom. Elmet is gone, but it is not lost, not while the land remembers, not while we do. Let your mind rest now, and sleep gently, knowing that even the quietest kingdoms leave echoes. The fall of Godon, warriors in the fog. Let your eyes drift closed once more. Feel the cool mist of northern winds brush against your thoughts, as if you're standing on a craggy hill above the North Sea, gazing out into the grey and endless horizon. This is where the kingdom of Godon once stood, a name barely remembered, a people nearly lost, and yet they left behind a voice, not in stone, nor in towering ruins, but in words, ancient, echoing poetry that still whispers across time. Let's go back to the 6th century. The Roman Empire is long gone, and in its place a fractured world remains, carved into small kingdoms, tribal lands, and shifting loyalties. Godund occupied the eastern coast of what is now southern Scotland, stretching from the Firth of Forth in the north, down into the lands around modern-day Lothian and Northumberland. It was a land of hills, rivers, and sudden cliffs, a land that once held one of the most mysterious and tragic tales of the Old North, and at the centre of that tale is Din Edin. That name may sound unfamiliar, but its descendant is not. Edinburgh. Yes, the capital of modern Scotland was once the fortress heart of this forgotten realm. Din Edin, the stronghold of the Godon people, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, watching, waiting, and from this fortress came one of the most poignant stories of the early medieval world, a tale called Y Godon. It is an old Welsh poem, perhaps the oldest surviving heroic poem in all of Britain. It tells of a feast, a gathering, and then a ride to war. According to the poem, the warriors of Godon feasted for a year, drinking mead, singing songs, preparing themselves, not for wealth, not for conquest, but for a final stand. Roughly 300 men, the best and bravest of the land, set out from Din Edin to attack the encroaching Anglian stronghold of Catraeth, now believed to be modern-day Catterick, in Yorkshire. They rode south, into legend. The poem tells us they fought bravely, with honour, with ferocity, and almost all of them were killed. It is a story of courage, but also of doom, of defiance in the face of the inevitable. Who were these men? We don't know their names, not all of them, but one stands out, Aneirin, the bard. He survived, and he remembered. He composed Y Godon, a poetic elegy to his fallen brothers, written in the old Brittonic tongue. His verses speak of riders cloaked in honour, of blades flashing like lightning, of songs sung with blood, but they also speak of something deeper, a people watching their world fade. Godund wasn't the only kingdom threatened. The Angles were pressing north, the Saxons were pushing west. Everywhere the Brittonic peoples were under siege, not just by sword but by language, by culture, by time. And yet here, in this poem, is resistance, not the kind you find on battlefields, but in memory. The Godund warriors may have fallen, their fortress may have become another city, their kingdom may have vanished, but Aneirin remembered. He gave them immortality in verse, and through him, we can imagine them now, seated at long feasting tables in Din Edin, laughter ringing through stone halls, as torches flicker and the cold wind howls outside. We can hear the sound of hooves on frozen ground as they rode into battle, knowing full well they would not return, and we can feel the ache of a lost world, slipping quietly beneath the waves of time. Godund fell, but not with silence, with song. Today, if you walk through the streets of Edinburgh, the hills still echo. Beneath the stone and bustle of the modern world, Din Edin remains. Its spirit lingers, in the cobbled streets, in the wind that races down the Royal Mile, in the poetry that somehow survived the centuries. So rest your thoughts here, in this in-between place. Let the tale of Godun carry you softly towards sleep. And remember, in the end it's not the size of a kingdom, or the victories it wins, that keep it alive. It's the stories, and the voices, that choose to remember. Olmec. The Woodland Kingdom. Let your mind drift again. This time, we move south, where the air is thick with the scent of forest rain and old soil. You're walking under a green canopy now. The trees above you have stood for centuries, perhaps longer. Their roots twist through ancient soil, curling around stones, whispering secrets only the earth remembers. This is Olmec, a forgotten kingdom, hidden in the woods. Not many remember it today, and yet, once it stood proud among the tangled map of post-Roman Britain, a land of oaks and mist, bounded not by walls, but by glades and streams. No fortress towers, no glimmering palaces remain, just silence, just trees, but walk slowly, and you might feel it, the presence of something old and careful, a kingdom carved more by time than by tools. Olmec lay in what is now West Yorkshire, wrapped between the Pennines to the west and the lower plains of England to the east. It was surrounded, pressed on all sides, yet it endured, for a time, in its wooded fastness. It was likely small, perhaps no more than a few valleys and scattered hilltops, but it was British, one of the last in the east, a relic of the old world, holding fast in a changing land. When the Romans withdrew, many regions collapsed into confusion, but Olmec lingered. Its people were Britons, speaking a version of Old Welsh, worshipping in ways that mixed Christian memory and older folk beliefs. Their ways were rooted deeply in the land, in the rhythm of seasons and the hush of the forest. They lived in small communities, perhaps hill forts repurposed, or Roman villas slowly reclaimed by vines. They farmed, hunted, made cloth and tools, sang songs passed down for generations. Life was quiet, local, but not without danger. The Anglo-Saxons were expanding. Kingdoms like Deira and Bernicia, ancestors to what would become Northumbria, were growing stronger. Their settlements moved ever closer. But for a time, Olmec remained, like a soft shadow in the trees. The king we know by name is Ceredig, probably ruling in the early 7th century. We don't know much about him, but what little we do comes from Bede, the venerable Anglo-Saxon historian. To Bede, Olmec was an obstacle, a remnant of the old ways. He records that Edwin of Northumbria, an ambitious ruler, seeking to unite the north, invaded Olmec and drove out Ceredig. No grand battle survives in song, no epic siege, just a quiet end. The woodland kingdom was absorbed into Northumbria, but its spirit lingered, in the names of places, in the stories told in hidden corners, and maybe, in the woods themselves. Even centuries later, the region was still referred to as Olmec. The Domesday Book, written in 1086, calls it Silver Olmec, the Forest of Olmec. Imagine that, 4 centuries after the kingdom's fall, the name still lived on in the land. What does that say about the people? That even in defeat, even when the world changes around you, the memory of home can hold strong. There are those who believe Olmec was a place of peace, not in the sense of quiet, but in the way it resisted the chaos of the time. Where others scrambled to build alliances, to raise armies, to dominate, Olmec held still. It endured. And though it was eventually consumed by a larger world, it left behind something unusual, a sense of stillness. In poetry, Olmec is remembered as a haunted place, not cursed, but reflective, a place where the trees remember, where the air is thick with the weight of things left unsaid. British poet Ted Hughes, centuries later, was born in what was once Olmec, and even he, long after, felt its presence. He called it the sacred center. Perhaps that's what Olmec was, not a military power, not a kingdom of gold and glory, but a quiet heart, beating in the woods while the rest of the world burned around it. So let your mind settle here, in the shade of tall trees. Feel the soft soil beneath your feet. Hear the wind move gently through the leaves. This is Olmec, a kingdom with no monuments, no great victories, just the resilience of silence, and the whisper of roots that run deep. The shadow of Deira. Let your breathing slow. Feel yourself relax. As the story turns eastward, toward the lowlands, to a place once known as Deira. It is a softer land than the moors and high places we've visited before, a place of gentle hills and wide, winding rivers, of farmland and forest, stretching out toward the sea. But beneath that calm surface, a story stirs, a story of ambition, of conquest, and of a kingdom that would come to shape the fate of all the north. You are now in what is today East and North Yorkshire, but in the 5th and 6th centuries, this was the rising land of Deira, a growing Anglo-Saxon power that would one day join with Bernicia, to form the mighty kingdom of Northumbria. But that lay in the future. Here, in the early days, Deira was young, eager, uncertain, and its roots stretched deep into the chaos left behind by Rome. No one knows quite how Deira began. Perhaps it started with a warband, a leader settling his people near the river Derwent, or the Ouse, a place to farm, to trade, to hold. What we do know is that by the mid-500s, Deira had kings. One of them, Ael, would become a name remembered in both history and legend. Ael was a king of the old pagan ways, fierce, ambitious, and he held lands once ruled by the Britons, perhaps even by the fading kingdom of Elmet, which we visited last. Where the Britons had farmed and prayed, now rose new halls, new gods, and new laws. But Deira was never truly alone. To the north, its powerful neighbor Bernicia stirred, the land of warriors and seafarers, of strongholds like Bamberg and Dunbar. Between Deira and Bernicia lay a tension, like two rivers winding toward the same sea, destined to meet. At first, the two kingdoms clashed, rival rulers, rival customs, rival claims. But the tide of history would force them together. A marriage, perhaps, a treaty, or a shared enemy. By the early 7th century, under the rule of a king named Edwin, the two kingdoms became one, and in that union, Deira gave birth to something greater. Edwin is a fascinating figure, a king born of exile, a Christian convert, a ruler who dreamed of more than mere survival. He expanded his reach beyond Deira, beyond Bernicia, toward the south, toward Mercia, and even into Wales. For a moment, his realm stretched from the Firth of Forth to the River Trent. But power is never easy to hold. Enemies rose, especially from the west, from places like Gwynedd and a fierce Welsh king named Cadwallon. In the year 633, Edwin was killed at the Battle of Hatfield Chase, a moment that would fracture the unity he'd forged and leave Deira once again exposed. But even in death, the path Edwin had walked left a mark. He had embraced Christianity, invited missionaries from Kent, and laid the foundations of the church in the north. His daughter would marry into powerful lineages. His legacy would echo through the halls of later kings, and though Deira would rise and fall in the decades to come, its role in forming the great kingdom of Northumbria and in planting the first Christian seeds in the Anglo-Saxon north would never be forgotten. Now, all is quiet in Deira. The fields lie still beneath the moonlight. The old rivers flow, just as they always have, and the names remain. York, once a Roman capital, became a Saxon stronghold, then a Viking one, then Norman. But beneath every layer, Deira lingers. Sometimes you can feel it, walking along the old Roman roads, or standing where the city walls still trace their ancient shapes. You might even hear a whisper in the trees, not a voice, just the weight of memory. So rest now. The tale of Deira is not one of great monuments or glittering courts. It is the story of a kingdom that rose from the quiet lowlands, tried to change the world, and left behind the first true shadow of empire in the Old North. And as we drift further into the past, we begin to see the shape of something larger, the merging of peoples, the layering of cultures, the slow unfolding of what would become England. But not just yet. For now the road still leads through scattered kingdoms, through voices half remembered, and landscapes where memory sleeps. The Lost Kings of Elmet. Let yourself settle, the world around you fades, and we return once more to the mists of forgotten time, to a kingdom that is no longer marked on any map, a name spoken only in whispers by poets and historians. Elmet. It sounds like something from a fairy tale, doesn't it? But once, Elmet was real. A small but proud British kingdom tucked between the rising powers of Deira to the east, Mercia to the south, and the high moors to the west. Today, its lands would fall mostly within what we call West Yorkshire, but long before the cities and mills, long before railways or red brick terraces, this was a land of wooded valleys and fortified hills, a land of survivors. For Elmet stood firm even as Rome crumbled, even as waves of Saxons swept inland from the sea, and even as its neighbours fell or bent the knee, Elmet held on. We know only fragments, a scattering of place names, Barwick, Sherburn, Aberford, a few tantalising lines in old chronicles, and the stories of a single shadowy king, Cerdig. He ruled in the early 7th century, when the noose was tightening. By then, Elmet was almost surrounded. To the north and east, the Angles of Deira were on the rise. To the west, the Brittonic kingdom of Rheged had faded. To the south, Mercia would soon emerge, a mighty force. Elmet, by contrast, was small, isolated, and dangerously independent. That independence could not last. The story goes that King Edwin of Northumbria, the same man we met last chapter, once exiled, took refuge for a time in Elmet, but something happened, a betrayal, a rift, or perhaps just politics, and when Edwin returned to power, he remembered, he marched into Elmet, around the year 616, by the sword or by negotiation, he took it. Cerdig was exiled, the kingdom absorbed, and with that, the last British kingdom east of the Pennines was no more, but something of Elmet survived, its people, its language, its stories. Some say the woods of Elmet were thick and tangled, a place where druids had once walked, and where the old gods lingered longer than anywhere else. The poet Ted Hughes, born in Yorkshire, later called it the Wild Land at the edge of time. Even now, if you wander through the hills near Ilkley, or the Aire Valley, you may find an ancient stone here, a lonely earthwork there, and feel something, a kind of forgotten resistance, a quiet pride in having once stood apart. There's a theory that Elmet's fall wasn't total, that the people remained, as peasants, monks and craftsmen, that even in defeat, their culture mingled quietly with the newcomers, and in that mingling, something new was born, a hybrid land, neither fully Saxon, nor entirely Brittonic, a patchwork memory. Over the centuries the name Elmet would fade, but it left its mark. In the Domesday Book, centuries later, the lands here were still sometimes called the Kingdom of Elmet, as if the land itself hadn't quite forgotten, and neither should we, because Elmet represents something rare in this long tale of war and conquest, a kingdom that resisted, held the line, and though conquered, left behind more than just ruins. It left a trace in the soul of the north, in the strange stillness of the Yorkshire woods, in the winding of the rivers, in the rhythm of old poems no one reads anymore. So close your eyes now, drift gently into that quiet land, hear the birdsong over an early mist, smell the damp moss, and walk through the woodland paths where kings once passed. Elmet is gone from the maps, but never fully gone. It lingers, in the land, in the names, and maybe, in you. The hollow fort of Dunbraden, in the far west of the Old North, where the River Clyde opens into the sea, and the land narrows into a wedge of wind-blown coast and green valley, there stands a jagged basalt rock that rises like the prow of a ship run aground. This is Dumbarton Rock, known in the old tongue as Dunbraden, the fortress of the Britons. It is one of the most remarkable places in post-Roman Britain, not only for its commanding presence and natural defences, but because for hundreds of years it served as the heart of a kingdom known as Altclut. While kingdoms like Regid and Elmet fell to the Anglo-Saxons and others faded into myth, Altclut endured, holding the line between the shifting powers of the north and west. Its people spoke Cumbric, a now lost cousin of Welsh, and their kings claimed descent from the ancient Britons who had resisted both Rome and the Germanic invaders that followed. The story of this place is one of astonishing resilience. The fortress itself, perched on two craggy summits, was nearly impregnable, commanding a view of the surrounding landscape for miles in every direction. This natural strength, combined with its strategic location at the mouth of the Clyde, allowed Altclut to flourish longer than many of its peers. The kings who ruled here maintained political independence through diplomacy, warfare, and occasionally by playing the rival factions of the north, Angles, Picts, Norse and Scots, against each other. But no fortress, no matter how formidable, is immune to the passage of time or the ambitions of stronger foes. By the 9th century, the greatest threat came not from the east, but from across the sea. Viking longships began to appear along the western coasts of Britain in greater numbers, and with more deadly intent. At first, these were raids, quick, brutal attacks against settlements and monasteries, but eventually, the Norse came in force, not just to plunder, but to conquer. In the year 869 AD, Dumbarton Rock came under siege by a combined Viking army, led by the Norse chieftains Olaf and Ivar, figures remembered in later sagas as warlords of ruthless determination. The siege lasted 4 long months. The defenders, likely cut off from reinforcements and supplies, endured hunger, disease, and the constant pressure of isolation. We know little about the day the fortress finally fell, but the annals record its sacking in grim simplicity. The fortress was taken and destroyed. Many of its inhabitants were either killed or enslaved, and the political heart of Altclut was torn out, but the people themselves, and the legacy of their kingdom did not vanish. In the decades that followed, the royal line of Altclut re-emerged inland, shifting their power base southward along the River Clyde, to what would later become Govan and Glasgow. This newly reorganized polity became known to later chroniclers as the Kingdom of Strathclyde. Strathclyde retained its Brittonic character for centuries, resisting assimilation from its neighbours even as the political landscape of Britain continued to shift. Its kings held their own courts, issued their own laws, and maintained a cultural memory that stretched back to the ruins of Rome and the old British ways. Yet by the 11th century, the pressure from the expanding Kingdom of Alba, what would become Scotland, was becoming impossible to resist. Whether through conquest, alliance or dynastic merger, Strathclyde was eventually absorbed. By the time historians were writing about Scotland in earnest, the distinct voice of Strathclyde had grown quiet, but it had not disappeared without leaving traces. To visit Dumbarton today is to walk upon stone that has witnessed more than 1,000 years of conflict and continuity. The rock is quiet now, shaped into a public park, its battlements reconstructed in later centuries. Yet climb to the summit and look out, and you can imagine the sentinels once posted there, eyes sweeping the waters for sails, voices raised in a language that no longer lives. You can feel the ghost of a kingdom that stood longer than most, against odds that would have seemed impossible. This chapter of the Old North is not one of swift collapse, but of adaptation. The story of Altclut and its rebirth as Strathclyde is a rare example of continuity in an age dominated by fragmentation. The people of the Old North were never truly unified, but many of them shared more than a language. They shared a memory of what came before. The Romans, the Druids, the old gods, the sacred stones, all of these shaped the way Britons understood their world. And though written records from Altclut are almost non-existent, their survival through oral tradition, genealogy, and the very bones of the landscape tells us they mattered. These weren't just holdouts of a fading culture, they were innovators in their own right, maintaining British identity under siege while others were being swept away. Tonight, as you rest and let your thoughts drift, remember the fortress that rose above the Clyde. Think of the kings who stood at its peak, staring into the setting sun, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The Old North is full of ruined halls and forgotten names, but Dumbarton is something more. It is a monument to the strength of place, the endurance of memory, and the fierce desire of a people not to vanish without a trace. So sleep now, with the wind of the Clyde whispering through ancient stone, and let the story of Dumbarton keep watch through the night. The Lost Kingdom beneath the hill. If you head east from the lands once held by Strathclyde, leaving behind the broad estuaries of the Clyde and the worn battlements of Dun Bretan, the land begins to rise gently, the hills folding into one another like ripples in ancient cloth. Here, among valleys dotted with slow-moving streams and old farms clinging to the contours of the land, lies a quiet place not marked by signs or ruins or any stone monument. But there is a name, soft, elusive, and nearly forgotten, whispered in poetry, remembered by few, and almost lost to time. This was the kingdom of Elmet. Most today have never heard of Elmet. There is no great cathedral that bears its name, no royal chronicle passed down in script, and yet it existed. For a brief but remarkable time in the centuries after Rome's departure, Elmet was a bastion of native British life in what is now the heart of Yorkshire. Unlike the more famous kingdoms of the Old North, Reged, Godden, Strathclyde, Elmet leaves almost no architectural legacy behind. But sometimes, the strongest presence is not in what we see, but in what refuses to be forgotten. Even now the name lingers faintly in the village of Barwick in Elmet, and in the faint lines of a few place names scattered across the modern map. These are echoes, quiet markers of a people who held out longer than most. What made Elmet special was not its size or its military power, but its position. It sat between growing Anglo-Saxon territories to the east and north, and the fading British heartlands to the west. In a time of shifting alliances and constant pressure, the kings of Elmet walked a dangerous tightrope, clinging to their identity while adapting to a world increasingly shaped by foreign customs, foreign gods, and foreign tongues. The early 6th century was not a gentle time. War was frequent, and the people of Elmet would have needed to live with both resilience and caution. We know from the few poems that survive from this era that the region was heavily wooded. Code Elmet, or the Forests of Elmet, a landscape where hidden valleys and thickets might shield a village or an army for days at a time. This landscape, mysterious and cloaked in green, likely protected the people of Elmet more than any wall could. But even the most protected valleys eventually opened to the wider world. Around the year 616, the fate of Elmet was sealed. A powerful warlord king from the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, Edwin, swept through the region in a campaign of conquest that would reshape the north of Britain for decades. The last known king of Elmet, a man named Cerdig, was either killed or exiled. His people, scattered, Elmet was swallowed into the Anglian realm, and over time, its language, its customs, and even its memory faded from common knowledge. But what happened to the people? They did not vanish. Archaeology tells us that the shift was not immediate. In some areas, Cumbric, the native British language, continued to be spoken well into the 8th century. Old burial practices lingered. Local lore preserved fragments of a deeper past. And some say that in the poems of Taliesin, there are veiled references to this lost land, verses that hint at alliances between Reged and Elmet, of kings who dined together and rode out in defense of a crumbling world. Whether those tales are literal or symbolic, we cannot say, but they tell us something deeper, that in the minds of the Britons Elmet was not forgotten, not entirely. Even now, historians puzzle over the silence left behind. Why so few mentions? Why such a complete erasure? And perhaps the answer lies in the way Elmet lived, not in shining cities or massive forts, but in the hollows of the forest, in kinship groups that were tight-knit, resilient, and wary of outsiders. Their legacy may not be carved in stone, but it may be tucked into the very landscape. If you walk through the woods of West Yorkshire today, you may be passing over ancient paths once trodden by the warbands of Elmet, or by the farmers who carried water in clay jars from the nearby springs. The air might feel thicker under certain trees, as if something still watches. The birdsong may fall quieter in certain clearings. The land has memory, even if we don't always know what it remembers, and for those sensitive enough to notice, that memory is palpable. It is the quiet presence that makes you pause, just for a moment, and wonder who stood here before you. Elmet in many ways represents the fragility of identity in a changing world. Its story is one of cultural persistence in the face of overwhelming pressure. And while it was eventually absorbed into something larger, the people of Elmet left a trace, however faint, on the shaping of northern Britain. Tonight, as you rest, let your thoughts wander to those wooded hills. Imagine the smoke from small hearths rising through the trees, the quiet murmur of a hidden village under twilight, and the sound of an old language spoken beside a fire. Think of Cerdig, not as a name in a list, but as a man, a father, a leader trying to protect what little remained of the world he knew. And as your breathing slows and the world around you dims, let Elmet remind you that even the smallest places, the quietest people, can leave behind echoes that last for centuries. The fortress in the mist, Din Idin, and the fall of the Gododin. There is a hill that rises above the sea, steep and sudden, dark against the sky, even on the brightest days. Today, it is crowned by a castle, and watched by thousands of people passing by, each day, mostly unaware of the great age beneath their feet. But long ago, before the tall towers and stone ramparts, this hill was known by another name, Din Idin, the fortress of Idin. It was not part of Scotland then. Scotland, as we know it, didn't exist, and it wasn't England either. Instead, this was the seat of the Gododin, one of the most mysterious and tragic kingdoms of the Old North. Perched on the eastern edge of the Hen Ogledd, Din Idin overlooked the Firth of Forth, a gateway to the Northern Sea. From its heights, the rulers of Gododin could watch the approach of enemy ships, the movement of traders, or the sweeping tides of a rising storm. It was a place of power, a stronghold that stood like a sentinel over the boundary between land and water, culture and conflict. The Gododin were a British people, likely descendants of those who had lived in the region since before the Romans came. But they were warriors too, shaped by centuries of fighting and survival on a constantly shifting frontier. Their language was a form of early Welsh, their customs drawn from both native tradition and the fading memory of Roman order. And for a time they flourished. But the story we remember most from Din Idin is not one of peace or prosperity. It is one of hope, sacrifice, and destruction. Somewhere around the end of the 6th century, the Gododin gathered their strength. Their kingdom was under pressure, encircled by expanding Anglian settlements and rival British polities. The old bonds of kinship that once united the kingdoms of the north had grown frayed, and help from afar was unlikely. Still, the king, known to us as Mynidog Munfara, made a decision that would echo for centuries. He summoned the bravest warriors he could find, from every valley and hill fort under his influence. They came to Din Idin, not for a feast, but for something far more solemn. It was a preparation for war. The target, Cattraeth, a stronghold held by the Angles, likely somewhere in modern-day Yorkshire. The mission was simple in its ambition: strike a decisive blow, and perhaps stem the tide of conquest that threatened all the Britons of the north. For a year the warriors of Gododin feasted, trained, and forged bonds stronger than steel. Their bravery was legendary, and they knew the odds were poor. But they went all the same, 300 men, mounted and armed, riding out from the fortress in the mist. What followed was a disaster. Almost all were killed. Only a handful returned, and yet, in failure, they became immortal. Their story was preserved in a poem, Y Gododdin, one of the oldest surviving works of British literature. Written not long after the events it describes, it is not a history in the modern sense, but a lament. A cry of grief and memory, naming each warrior who fell and holding them up as an example of bravery beyond reason. We don't know the author for certain, though tradition attributes it to a bard named Aneurin. What we do know is that the words have survived for over 1,000 years, passed down across generations, and through those words, the Gododdin live on. Why did they ride out, knowing they would die? Perhaps they believed it was better to fall in defiance than fade in retreat. Perhaps they hoped to inspire unity among the other British kingdoms, or perhaps they simply had no other choice. Whatever the reason, their charge at Cattraeth stands as one of the defining moments in the long twilight of the Old North. After the battle, the kingdom of Gododdin did not recover. Pressure from the Angles increased, and by the early 7th century, Dinaidin itself fell into foreign hands. The name changed. The culture shifted. Over the centuries, the city that grew up around the hill became known by its anglicised name, Edinburgh, and the memory of the Gododdin faded into legend, but not entirely. Even today, the echoes are there. In the contours of the land, in the rhythm of old poems. In the sense that beneath the modern city lies something older, deeper, harder to name. Some say that in the early morning fog, when the mist curls around the rocks and the sea air carries the scent of salt and rain, you can still feel the presence of those who gathered at Dinaidin so long ago. Warriors with no hope, drinking to the memory of what was, and the shadow of what might have been. And perhaps that is what makes this story worth remembering. The Gododdin did not win, they did not survive as a kingdom. But in their refusal to go quietly, they left something that has endured far longer than a throne or a flag. They left a story, one that speaks to the courage of those who choose meaning over safety, legacy over life. As you settle in tonight, and your thoughts begin to slow, imagine the cold stone of the old hill beneath you, the call of seabirds overhead, the clatter of hooves as 300 riders vanish into the morning mist, knowing they may never return. And let that image carry you, gently, slowly, into the quiet places of sleep. The quiet fall of the kingdoms. By the time the 7th century drew on, much of the northern world we've come to know, those scattered kingdoms of the Old North, was already beginning to slip from history into legend. But the change didn't happen all at once. There was no great battle that spelled the end of Rehagid, or of Elmate, or the flickering shadows of Gododdin. Instead, there was a slow erosion, a fading, like the dimming of a fire, left too long in the hearth, still warm, still alive, but no longer bright. In the valleys where kings once rode at the head of 100 loyal warriors, there were now quiet pastures, misty in the mornings, and still in the evenings. The same hills that had once echoed with the clash of swords and the cries of cattle raiders now rang with birdsong and the low bleating of sheep. And still the people lived there, not vanished, but changed. You might imagine the fall of a kingdom to be violent, but here, in the Old North, it was often quieter than that. Power slipped away like mist on the hillsides. One day, a warlord might stop collecting tribute from a distant village. The next, a rival might move in without a fight. A young leader raised on tales of Uri and Rehagid might find no one left to rally beneath his banner. In some places, the old names lingered. In others, they were forgotten entirely, overwritten by new rulers, new settlers, and new tongues. Brittonic speech gave way to Old English in the east, to Gaelic in the northwest, and to Norse along the coasts. But not all at once. For generations, people would have spoken mixed dialects, remembered old gods alongside new saints, kept fragments of older ways stitched into the fabric of newer lives. There are clues, of course. A carving here, a poem there, a hill fort reused, then abandoned again. A stone cross, standing where once a pagan shrine might have been. The records are silent in many cases, but silence tells its own story. Take Rehagid, for instance, a powerful kingdom in its day, proud, poetic, martial. Its influence may have stretched from the Solway Firth all the way to the Pennines, perhaps even farther. But by the early 8th century, it is gone from the written record, not conquered, not destroyed, just gone. Archaeologists speculate, perhaps it was absorbed into Northumbria, quietly and without violence. Perhaps its ruling line simply died out, or maybe, over generations, it became something else entirely. A region remembered in song, but no longer ruled in any meaningful way. It's the kind of vanishing that only makes sense when you visit these places, when you walk those quiet hills and feel the deep time beneath your feet. There's something uniquely haunting about a power that fades without a fight. Something almost mournful in the way the old ways slipped away, unrecorded, and yet, it's also peaceful. Like watching the last light of day slip beneath the horizon, knowing that it was always going to be this way. People still lived here, of course. Farmers still tilled the land, children still played beside streams. Life went on, though the royal courts and warbands no longer did. In many ways the land returned to what it had always been before kings, before Rome, before even writing. Just land, hills and rivers, sky and soil. A place to live, to bury your dead, to raise your children. The memory of kingdoms lingered like smoke, but they were no longer needed in the same way. And yet, in monasteries and courts farther south, the memory of the Old North lived on. In Wales especially, the tales were preserved. Names like Rhian and Owain, like Gododin and Cattraeth, survived because the bards carried them forward. They were not forgotten, they were turned into legend, and legends, as we know, often last longer than kings. So now, centuries later, we find ourselves returning to this quiet land, listening again for the echoes that still drift through the heather and stone, and we wonder, who were they really? These kings without thrones, these warriors without walls, these people who slipped between the cracks of history and left only whispers behind. Maybe, in the end, the story of the Old North is not about defeat. Maybe it's about transformation, about how a world can end, not with a scream, but with a breath, and how, even as the kingdoms faded, something else was born. A memory, a feeling, a quiet tale passed down through 1,000 sleepless nights, and that is why we return here. To this moor, to this hill, to this road, that once bore armies and now bears only the wind. We return not to mourn, but to remember, to listen, and to rest. The night is long, but the stories remain, so close your eyes now. Let the worries of the present fall away. You are safe here, in this forgotten land. The kingdoms may have vanished, but their voices still sing softly in the dark. This is the Old North, and you are not alone. The monks of the borderlands. When the warrior kings faded, and the hill forts fell silent, the land did not grow still. In fact, something else was quietly stirring. Along the edge of the Irish Sea, in wind-battered valleys, and tucked away clearings beneath the shadow of old Roman ruins, a different kind of power was beginning to take root. Not the clang of swords, but the slow scratch of ink on parchment. Not warbands, but wandering monks. It is hard now to imagine how much of early medieval Britain was shaped, not by kings, but by those silent scribes in long robes, the ones who carried no weapons, but who carried memory. In the wake of the Old North's collapse, it was these men, followers of a quiet, ascetic Christianity, often far removed from Rome, who began to rebuild in their own way. These early monastic settlements were nothing like the towering stone abbeys that would come later. They were simple places, clusters of wooden huts encircled by ditches or stone walls, often near holy wells or old sacred groves. The line between pagan and Christian was still blurry in these early days. Stories of saints were filled with miracles that echoed old druidic lore. Holy men calmed storms, tamed beasts, and spoke with the dead. And in the far northwest of the old Regid lands, near the coast where the Irish Sea crashes endlessly into dark cliffs, came one of the most influential centers of this spiritual revival, the monastery of Whithorn. Founded, legend says, by Saint Ninian in the 4th century, it continued to flourish even as empires fell and kingdoms faded. We don't know much about Ninian. The stories are scattered, filled with contradictions, but his name lingered in the oral traditions, and his monastery endured long enough to become a beacon. Irish monks came across the sea, bringing with them books and songs, sacred relics, and new ways of worship. They mingled with Brittonic traditions, creating something uniquely northern, a Christianity shaped by wind and stone. Further inland, along the Roman wall, other communities began to grow. In the ruins of old forts, chapels were built. Stones that once formed the walls of barracks now framed altars. Monks moved into places once garrisoned by soldiers. At Burdoswald, evidence suggests the site remained occupied for centuries after the Roman withdrawal. Some think a local elite lived there, perhaps descended from Roman officers who had married into the native Brittonic families. The idea is fascinating. that within the crumbling shell of empire, a new kind of leadership emerged, one that combined military ancestry with Christian piety, not quite kings, not quite priests, but something in between. And then there is Lindisfarne, though a little east of our story's heartland, this holy island, founded in the early 7th century by Aidan, an Irish monk from Iona, would soon become one of the most important religious centers in Britain. From here, missionaries traveled south and west, bringing their teachings into the tangled remnants of the Old North. They preached to people who still remembered the names of ancient kings, and who still told stories by firelight of the old gods and the lost battles. But even as Christianity spread, it didn't erase the past, it absorbed it. Old hilltops once used for pagan rituals became the sites of chapels. Local saints were often former warriors or chieftains remembered for their wisdom as much as their holiness. There is a continuity here, one that doesn't reject the Old North, but instead layers itself gently over it. Imagine walking through these lands now. It is perhaps the 8th century. The chaos of the 5th and 6th has faded, but not disappeared. In the distance, you see smoke rising from a monastic hearth. The path you walk is still Roman, though its stones are uneven and cracked. Along the edges, carved crosses mark places where prayers were once said. A monk passes by, head bowed, reciting scripture in Latin with a northern lilt. Somewhere, beneath that same soil, lie the bones of a king, unmarked, unnamed, but still part of the land. This was a time of quiet transformation, a reshaping of identity, and although the kingdoms of the Old North no longer held sway, the people had not vanished. Their language persisted, in corners and pockets, in lullabies and field names, in the carved stones left by long-dead hands. And their stories too, persisted, not in royal chronicles or official records, but in the memories of those monks who carried oral traditions into written form. The Godud, the Annales Cambria, the poetry of Taliesin, all these fragments may owe their survival to scribes who found value in the old songs, even as they praised new saints. In these monasteries, the legacy of the Old North was not just remembered, it was curated, preserved, given shape. And so tonight we find ourselves here, on the border between worlds once again, between empire and ruin, between war and peace, between legend and record. The old kingdoms may be gone, but their echoes remain. In every manuscript, in every crumbling chapel, in every windswept name, still whispered by the hills, the monks of the borderlands did not carry swords, but they carried memory, and thanks to them, we still remember. Now let the quiet take you, let your breath slow. You are drifting across time again, into a world where silence meant safety, and the firelight glowed soft across stone. You are in the Old North, and the story is far from over. The watchers on the wall, the winter that followed the gathering at Cowper-le-Gwelyd settled like a breath held too long. Across the valleys and ridgelines of the Old North, the cold was sharp but not cruel, dry winds sweeping in from the east, as if the land itself were pausing, waiting for something yet unnamed. In the west, snow clung to the upper slopes of the fells, and the high moors crackled with frost. But beneath the quiet, things were moving. From the old fort at Burdoswald, high upon the wall that the Romans once built to mark the edge of their empire, watchers still kept vigil. The wall had long since crumbled in places, its stones scavenged for farms and churches, but its spirit remained. It stood not just as a monument to what had once been, but as a thread through time, still visible, still walked upon, still remembered. Among the watchers now was a boy of only 15 winters named Aneurin, descended from no kings, marked by no bloodline of note. His family had come from a nearby village, farmers and herders, but he had been taken into the service of the fort's commander. After his quickness, with a bow was noticed during a midsummer feast. Though too young to be called a warrior, he listened well, and more importantly, he remembered. And it was memory that mattered most here. Not just in tales around the fire, but in how the stones spoke when touched, how the hill shadowed the sun, how the path twisted before it reached the trees. Memory in this land was as much a survival skill as any blade. Aneurin would wake before the dawn, climb the narrow stair of a watchtower that no longer had a roof, and sit in the biting air, with only the sound of the wind for company. He had been told to look east, always east, for that was where danger would come from. Not from the old roads, but from the hidden tracks that laced through forest and fen. But Aneurin, like many boys, was curious. He looked everywhere. To the north he could see where the land dropped away into low hills, where the mist hovered like a second sky. Beyond that, on a clear day, the grey shimmer of the Solway Firth, and on some mornings, the sun would rise like an ember behind the distant silhouette of Criffel. the solitary hill in the far distance, rising above the land like a question that had never been answered. The men of the watch spoke little of what had come before them. Some feared the stories of the old kings, of Urien and Owain, of doomed Dingari and lost Rigid. They said too much, remembering invited the dead to walk, but others, usually after a mug of warm ale, would speak of how the wall had once buzzed with life, torchlight dancing on stone, Latin prayers echoing in cold barracks, soldiers from lands so distant they barely believed in snow. Now, the wall had new sentinels, Britons, not of Rome, not of Saxon stock, but born of the in-between. And it was in the in-between that the Old North still lived, in half-remembered laws, in broken fortresses repurposed for council halls, in churches built from Roman stones but filled with songs in Brythonic tongues. Far south of the wall, in the land that had once been Elmet, whispers spread of war bands massing again, Anglian princes flexing muscle, pushing westward. Yet along the northern frontier, something quieter stirred. Messengers from the Isle of Man had come ashore, speaking of shadowy fleets seen beyond the Irish Sea. Old Norse names were heard again in markets, and in the mountain valleys of Strathclyde, monks found new carvings on ancient stones, marks no one could translate, but which stirred old fears. It was said that time moved slowly in the north, but in truth, it moved like deep water, silently, until it surged. One night, Aneurin sat alone at his post, the moon a thin smile overhead, the land below blanketed in frost. A faint sound caught his ear, not footsteps, not voices, but the low, rhythmic thump of something large, a heartbeat, a drum. He leaned forward, squinting into the dark. There, in the far distance just before the tree line, a faint flicker of light moved once, then vanished. No alarm was sounded, no horns blown, but something had changed. The next morning, he told the commander what he'd seen. The man listened, nodded once, then gave the boy new orders. Watch the same spot each night, nothing more. A week passed, then another. The light did not return, but the feeling remained, that sense of the past reaching forward, trying to speak, and perhaps that was what the Old North was, more than anything, not a place, but a conversation across centuries, between the ones who built the wall, and those who stood on it now, between the fallen kings, and the living dreamers, between what was, and what could yet be. As Aneurin stood watch on the 15th night, the stars overhead gleamed like flint. He didn't speak, he barely breathed, but in that silence, he began to understand. The wall was not merely something to guard, it was something to remember, and in remembering, it lived. The wall that watched the world change. Long after the legions had vanished, the wall remained. It rose like a spine of stone across the northern wilds, stretching from the mouth of the Tyne to the distant Solway Firth, weathered and worn, but still proud, the legacy of an empire that once called itself eternal. Though the guards had gone, and the orders no longer echoed in Latin, Hadrian's wall stood watch over a land that had not yet settled. It watched the seasons shift, the tides of peoples come and go, and the flicker of campfires lit by those who no longer remembered who had built it, or why. In the time of the Old North, the wall was not a border in the way we think of borders now. It was a relic, a reminder, of a world once orderly and vast, and now broken into fragments. Along its line, the bones of old forts still clung to their shape. Vindolanda, Burdoswald, Housesteads, names that once pulsed with imperial routine. In this post-Roman age, they were instead quiet redoubts, scavenged for stone, haunted by memory, yet not entirely abandoned. In the centuries after Rome's retreat, some among the Britons still clung to the wall's spine. They built their homes near the fortresses, sometimes within them, reshaping barracks into halls and temples into sheepfolds. At Burdoswald, evidence shows the continuation of life, the faint stirrings of a people who didn't just survive the fall, but tried to carry something forward from it. Perhaps they saw themselves as heirs of Rome, or perhaps they simply lived where the walls kept the wind at bay. The kings of Rigid, whose strongholds lay not far to the west, would have known this region well. The wall was part of their world, not as a defensive line, but as a landmark, a place of significance, a road of sorts. Parts of the old Roman road still ran beside it. The Staingate, once patrolled by cavalry and messengers, now it was trodden by warbands and wandering traders, by monks and poets carrying tales across the Old North. Imagine a young warrior of Rigid, perhaps the son of a minor chieftain, sent eastward along the wall to learn of the old places, to see where the empire had held firm and then faltered. He walks amid the ruins of a granary, whose roof collapsed before his grandfather was born. He traces the carved letters on a stone altar, unable to read the words but sensing their weight. He sleeps in a hollow of earth, where once a garrison cooked its meals, and in his dreams perhaps he sees them, the ghosts of the legions, boots on gravel, voices raised in languages now lost. The wall remembers, it always remembers. In the centuries following the end of Roman rule, tales began to swirl around these ruins. They became the settings for stories of sleeping armies beneath the hills, of treasures hidden in cellars, of strange creatures that watched from broken towers. The imagination of the Britons, never far from the supernatural, wove the wall into their mythologies. In Welsh poetry and early medieval chronicles, echoes of these stories remain. Some claimed the wall was built not by Romans, but by giants. Others said it marked the edge of the world, that beyond it lay chaos and ice. For many in the south, it did. North of the wall, after all, the land grew rougher, the forests thicker, the languages less familiar. This was the realm of Strathclyde and Godden, of the Picts and the mysterious peoples beyond. But to the people of the Old North, the wall was not a division, it was a connection, a reminder of what had come before, and what might still come again. As kingdoms rose and fell around it, the wall endured. When the plague came in the 6th century and decimated communities from the Irish Sea to the Roman roads, it stood. When famine followed, and drought, and skies that dimmed for months, it stood. And when the kings of Regid and Elmet and Bernicia clashed over river valleys and passes, it stood. Indifferent to their victories and losses alike, time moved differently here, slowly, patiently, and in that stillness, something lingered, a sense that this place mattered, that though the world had turned and the empires had fallen, the land itself remembered, and the wall, with its watchtowers and milestones, its crumbled gates and silent stones, was the keeper of those memories. Later chroniclers would come. Bede, writing in his monastery at Jarrow, not far from the wall's eastern reach, would mention it with respect. Others, centuries later, would mistake it for something else, calling it the work of Arthur, or some long-lost British king. But those who lived near it, in the centuries after Rome, knew it differently. It was not just a ruin, it was a threshold, between old and new, between what had been, and what might be again. So tonight as you rest, imagine that long spine of stone under the stars, imagine the wind brushing over the grass where once legions marched, imagine the hush of the moorland, the call of a night bird, and the quiet breathing of a world still dreaming of its past. Let the wall keep watch while you sleep, let its ancient silence carry you gently into dreams. The river between kingdoms. In the years following the brief flame of Urien's reign and the turmoil of his sons, the land did not grow quiet, it simply changed. The old borders had shifted again, and though Regid's influence still lingered in parts of the Eden Valley and the hills of Cumbria, much of what had been one of the most formidable British kingdoms had dissolved into memory. But the echoes of its past continued to ripple outward, carried by bards and whispered in fireside stories, some true, some not, but all carrying the weight of what once was. Further east, where the rolling green valleys gave way to wide rivers and thicker forests, a new stage was being set. The River Wear, winding gently through the hills that would later cradle the city of Durham, had once marked a vague, natural frontier, not between nations but between worlds. On one side were the remnants of the Old North, still clinging to their languages and stories. On the other, the tide of Anglian settlement continued to rise, slow and uneven, but persistent. The Anglian peoples, largely pagan, deeply rooted in clan loyalties, and still relatively new to this land, had no memory of Rome. They did not walk the roads with awe, nor look to the old forts as places of power. To them these were strange relics, useful perhaps, but not sacred. Yet even they could not ignore the pull of the rivers. For rivers were the lifeblood of every community, sources of fish, of trade, and of connection, and in the shadow of rivers, power could rise quickly. It was here, along the Wear, and further south along the Tees, that smaller Anglian kingdoms began to take root in the early 7th century. They had names that are seldom spoken now: Deira, Bernicia, and eventually, the fused kingdom of Northumbria. But in their earliest days, these places were fragile, little more than warbands gathered around a chieftain with ambition. Yet as one generation gave way to the next, those ambitions grew. By this time, Christianity had begun to return to the island, not as the faith of Roman bishops, but as a new and uncertain thing, brought from Ireland and Gaul, carried by missionaries and monks who spoke Latin and Irish, and perhaps even a little British. And as they moved eastward, they crossed not only rivers and valleys, but old cultural frontiers. In places, they were welcomed. In others, they were feared. One such man, whose footsteps would echo through time, was a Roman Briton, named Aidan. He would not arrive for many years yet, but the groundwork for his mission was already being laid. Small monastic communities were beginning to emerge along the coasts and rivers, simple places built of timber and thatch, often near old Roman ruins. These were more than just places of worship, they were places of literacy, of memory, of stillness. And in a world still plagued by violence and uncertainty, stillness was a rare and precious thing. Back in the heart of the Old North, a few scattered hill forts still bore the signs of habitation, old stones repurposed for new walls, Roman wells still providing water to those who knew where to find them. But the great gatherings of armies, the high courts of kings, and the boisterous bardic halls were gone. What remained was smaller families, perhaps a local lord, clinging to the memory of past glories. And then there were the forests, vast and quiet, barely touched by the axe. They stretched across much of the central north, between the Pennines and the eastern coast. To the Britons, these woods were sacred and ominous, the homes of spirits and memories. To the Anglians, they were wilderness to be tamed. And so, settlement slowly crept forward, clearings made, halls raised, cattle driven along new paths. Yet it wasn't only the Anglians who advanced. From the west, along the Irish Sea came others, sea raiders and traders, some from Ireland, others from places even further off. These new arrivals brought their own languages, their own ways of building, their own gods and customs, and in some quiet coves, they settled, joining with local Britons, or displacing them, leaving behind artifacts that confuse modern archaeologists to this day. There is a hill in the north, above the mouth of the River Tees, where the ruins of an early fort still lie hidden beneath grass and heather. No name survives for it, but the people who once lived there would have known both fear and power. For from that vantage point, one could see for miles, across river and valley, across farmland and forest. They would have seen smoke rising from distant villages, perhaps heard the call of horns echoing through the morning mist. Was it a friend's call, or an enemy's? The people of that time would not have known they were living in a turning point. They did not think of themselves as part of the fall of one world or the rise of another. They simply lived, they raised children, they buried their dead, they hoped for peace and prepared for war, and all the while, the land remembered. For even as languages changed, and kings rose and fell, the land held its stories. In the quiet curve of a riverbank, in the worn stones of a forgotten path, in the chill of the evening wind as it passed through empty ruins, this was still the Old North. Though its names would change, and its people scatter, the bones of that forgotten world still rested beneath every field and hill. And even now, if you lie still and listen, really listen, you might hear the whisper of footsteps long gone, a rider on the road, a song carried on the wind, a name once spoken in battle, now only remembered in dreams. Sleep now, there is still more to come. The quiet stronghold. As the fading light of the 7th century gave way to the first uncertain steps of the 8th, the world of the Old North had already changed beyond recognition. The mighty names of Reged and Gododin had slipped quietly into the shadows of memory. Once powerful, their strongholds now stood empty, their ramparts softened by moss and rain, and their names preserved only in bardic songs or whispered tales, passed down by families who remembered when kings had walked among them. Yet not all was lost. Hidden in the folds of hills and the mists of the western marches, some places endured in silence. They were not always rich, nor always strong, but they were rooted. They held something the chaos had not taken. One such place lay nestled in the upper valleys of the Eden, a quiet fortress town whose name is barely spoken today, if it was ever known beyond its borders at all. No great battle is recorded there, no legendary king ever claimed it as his seat, but it lived on. While cities fell and warbands roamed, this place persisted, its fields were ploughed, its sheep still grazed the hills, and its elders passed judgment in small timber halls, warmed by peat fires. There is something quietly heroic in that survival. Not every story needs a war to be worth telling. Sometimes, to keep living is enough. Archaeology tells us that, unlike other settlements which dwindled or were abandoned entirely, this small place kept its rhythm. Its pottery, simple but unchanged. Its buildings, modest but mended year after year. Its burial grounds remained active, with no great gap to mark a plague or a massacre. If we trust the land, we might say that this valley became a refuge, not just from violence, but from the collapse of meaning that swallowed so many places after Rome, and so we imagine them here. A woman gathering water from a stream that had once fed a Roman bathhouse, now little more than ruins overgrown with nettles. A boy learning to carve letters in the old script, unaware that elsewhere such skills had been entirely lost. A man repairing a wall with stones first laid by legionaries centuries earlier, humming an old tune as he worked. The old world lingered not in monuments, but in gestures, in habits, in the quiet decision to keep a way of life going, even when no one was watching. Further west in the shadows of the Cumbrian fells, we find similar stories, small communities clinging on not by power, but by patience. They watched kingdoms rise and fall around them, and chose perhaps without choosing to endure. While the bards sang of heroes and kings, these people became the soil in which future nations would grow, unmarked on maps, unnamed in chronicles, yet essential all the same. By the early 8th century, the language spoken in these valleys had changed little from the tongue of the Hen Ogledd. Brittonic, soft and flowing, rich with meaning drawn from hills and rivers, yet the world beyond them was hardening. To the east, Anglo-Saxon rule stretched further than ever before. Bernicia and Deira had merged to form Northumbria, and kings like Ecgfrith dreamed of glory not just in battle, but in conquest over nature itself. Monasteries were rising, new centers of learning and faith funded by ambitious rulers seeking legitimacy in the eyes of both man and God. But here, in the western hills, the change was slower. Faith arrived not with sword or sermon, but with time. A stone cross on a hillside, a holy well visited by travelers, the mingling of belief, where old gods were not entirely abandoned, but folded gently into the new. Saints walked here too, not the kind that built great churches, but the kind who slept under trees and spoke with animals, who healed with herbs and prayed in silence. It's tempting to think of history as the story of the powerful, of kings and wars, conquests and treaties, but the Old North teaches us another kind of history. A history written not in ink but in silence, in lives lived steadily in places others forgot, and in that forgetting, something precious was preserved. For even as the light of British kingdoms dimmed in the north, their memory settled deep into the landscape. The old ways, the old stories, they were never truly gone, only quiet. And now, as you lie back and listen, drifting softly into sleep, think of those silent valleys and their watchful hills. Think of the people who kept going, even when no one told their story. Think of the quiet strongholds, the hidden heart of the Old North. The last candle in the hall. By the time the wind began to shift, and the skies took on that greyish hue so often seen in the north before a storm, the world of the Old North had already changed forever. But the people living in it could not yet see it. They were too close, still tangled in their daily struggles and wary alliances, too occupied with keeping the fires lit and the barley safe from the rains. They did not know, not yet, that they were becoming echoes, that their names were already slipping into myth, that the hills would forget their footsteps and only the stories would remain. In the valley lands of what had once been Reged, now a scattered patchwork of holdings under uncertain lords, a small stone hall still stood. The walls were worn with time, patched over the years by hands both loving and desperate. Moss crept up its sides, and inside, the timber beams still held the smoke of 100 winters. At its center, an old hearth flickered weakly in the dimming light, and beside it sat a man few would now name a king, but who, once had been. His name was Morkant, a grandson, it was said, of the great Urien, though whether that was true or simply a tale repeated by his house to ward off decay, was hard to say. He bore the look of a man who had once ridden in battle, once held a banner high, once been greeted with the bowed heads of retainers and the songs of bards. But now those who remained in the hall were few, a young boy tending the sheep, a woman, perhaps his daughter, grinding the last of the stored grain, an old priest, whispering prayers in both Latin and the native tongue. Morkant did not mourn what was lost. He had no time for mourning any more. He stared at the fire as if trying to remember the shape of something, not a person, or even a place, but a feeling. The way it had felt to ride beneath the banners of Reged, to stand shoulder to shoulder with others who believed, as he had, that their way would endure. Outside, the wind sighed through the moorland, bending the tall grasses like an unseen tide. The land remembered, even if the people no longer did, the paths they walked, the walls they leaned against, the hollows where water pooled after rain, all of it bore the weight of centuries. The Roman roads were still there, buried or broken, still guiding those who cared to follow them, but few did any more. The new lords built along different lines, their roads were paths between churches, their strongholds timber palisades, built in places the old kings would never have chosen. And yet, not everything was gone. The old priest, whose name no one now wrote down, still carried with him a fragment of a song from before even his father's time. He recited it some nights when the wind howled loud enough to cover his voice, as if to keep the words hidden from the stars. It spoke of a high king who never truly died, whose body was taken by the waves to the west, where the sun goes down, and where he waited still, to return when the land was in greatest need. Some said it was Arthur, others said it was Urien, still others said it was no one, just a tale, a comfort for a cold night. But Morkant listened, and in his eyes flickered something like memory, not belief, not quite, but the echo of belief which can sometimes be just as strong. In a nearby glen, a traveller passed that same night, following an old ridge path once used by messengers between kingdoms. He did not know the name of the hall where Morkant still sat. He had never heard of Urien, or of Regid, or even of the Hen Ogledd, but he paused, just for a moment, at the sound of faint singing in the wind, a voice without a name, carried from the past like smoke through the trees, and he listened. That is the nature of memory in the Old North. It does not come when you call it. It comes when the land is quiet enough to speak, when the fires burn low, and when your eyes are heavy with the weight of sleep. They say that was the last winter Morkant ever saw. When spring came, the hall was empty. The hearth had gone cold, but the door still hung open, as if waiting. And sometimes travelers say, they see a flicker of firelight from within, long after nightfall. Maybe it's just the wind, maybe it's just the stars playing tricks on tired eyes, or maybe, just maybe, the Old North remembers still. So rest now, and dream, for the story does not end here. One more chapter remains in this long-forgotten saga, and it waits for you, just beyond the next hill. The silence beyond the wall. The wind had changed by the time the last of the firelight faded from the hall. The great wooden beams of the roof groaned softly as the night deepened, and all that remained was the slow crackle of cooling embers. Outside, under a cold sky scattered with faint stars, the land held its breath. It was in this hush, this weighty stillness, that old things stirred, not with noise, but with presence. Beyond the ancient ridge, past the shadows cast by the fallen stones of the hall, the land sloped down into a narrow valley. It was a place many had once passed through, but few remembered. Here the trees grew thicker, older, branches twisted like old hands gripping at the sky, and buried beneath their roots were the remains of a road, long forgotten, long unused. It had once connected the fortresses along the wall with the broader trade routes of the north. Now it served no purpose but to wait. Moss grew thick along its flanks. The ghosts of wheel ruts and sandaled feet etched faint patterns into the mud and stone, for the old empire had come this way once, not with armies, but with surveyors and planners, with maps and picks and chisels. The road they left behind had lasted centuries, until the world changed. Now, a single rider moved slowly along it, cloak pulled tight, eyes searching the shadows. He was not a warrior or a king, at least not anymore. He was a messenger, carrying words from one crumbling holdfast to another, hoping to find someone still listening. His path traced not only the old road, but also the remnants of the old alliances, those forgotten bonds that had once held the northern kingdoms together. There had been a time when messengers like him rode openly safely, when a single emblem on a brooch or shield was enough to guarantee passage. Now, such tokens held little power, but the old families remembered. Some of them, anyway. He reached the edge of a long-abandoned village, just before midnight. It was barely more than a scattering of low walls, and one sagging wooden lintel, still hanging above a door that had not opened in decades. He dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a long dead tree, and stepped inside. The hearth had been stripped bare long ago. Rain had found its way through the broken roof, and moss grew thick across the threshold, but something still lingered here. A feeling, a weight. He crouched beside the hearth, and reached into the ashes, cold, but dry, as if someone had tended a fire here not long ago. He did not call out, the silence was too deep for that. Instead he pulled the message from beneath his cloak, and set it carefully on the stone beside the hearth. A folded scrap of vellum, sealed with wax. It bore the symbol of a hawk clutching 3 thorns, a sigil not seen openly in nearly 50 years. He left it there, and stepped back out into the night, unaware of the eyes watching him from the shadows beyond the broken wall. Not unfriendly eyes, not yet, just cautious, curious. This was how word still spread in the Old North, quietly, carefully, from ruin to ruin, from keeper to keeper, not through armies or councils, but through the stubborn efforts of those few who still believed that something might be salvaged. For the wall, The great stone divide that once marked the boundary of empire still stood in places, not all of it, but enough. Its stones overgrown, repurposed, worn by wind and time, but enough remained to mark where civilization had once reached its edge, and even now, it drew people to it, pilgrims, wanderers, scholars, and those with nowhere else to go. One such place stood high on a windswept bluff, a watchtower built by the Romans and used by many since. In its lowest chamber, a brazier still burned, and 3 figures sat around it, cloaked and silent. One was very old, another was barely a man, and the third, a woman with grey-streaked hair and eyes like flint, was speaking softly of things few remembered. "They never stopped watching," she said, her voice just louder than the wind. "Not entirely, even after the legions left, even after the old kings fell. There were always those who waited, who hoped, who guarded." The boy leaned forward. Guarded what? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. The memory, the idea, that we were once more than scattered holds and quarreling lords, that we were one people, and that we might be again. Outside the wind picked up, and the brazier hissed as cold air swept through the cracks in the stone, but none of them moved. It was true, what she said. The Old North was not gone, not completely. Its memory had survived not in books or monuments, but in quiet stories passed from parent to child, in names carved faintly into hilltops, in songs sung beneath breath around dying fires. And in that moment, as the boy listened, as the rider moved further west, as the message sat waiting in a dead village, the Old North lived again, not as a kingdom or a banner, but as a whisper carried on the wind, and sometimes when the land is quiet and the stars are bright, you can still hear it, calling you home. Beneath the hill of echoes, there was a quiet to the morning that followed, a hush that settled over the green slopes and empty ridges as if the very land was holding its breath. The last candle in the hall had guttered out, and with it, the flickering thread of a lineage that had stretched back through generations of forgotten kings, bardic names and battle cries, swallowed by time. But something else remained in the air, not just absence, but echo, as though the voices of the past, now freed, had begun to stir again beneath the earth. They came in dreams first, a whisper in the ear of a shepherd asleep on the high fells, the flicker of movement beyond the tree line, a low sound, like breath through hollow stone, from the mouths of long-sealed barrows. Across the north, in places untouched by plough or hammer, people began to feel it, a restlessness, not of fear, but of memory. There was an old tale, passed on in hushed tones from the west coast of Strathclyde, all the way to the eastern marchlands of what had once been Benicia, of a place hidden under a low, grass-covered hill, a place where the wind always sounded like voices, a place where the dead did not sleep. They called it the Hill of Echoes. Not many had sought it, most only knew it as a story, something to keep children from wandering too far. But for the few who still held the old knowledge, the forest dwellers, the line walkers, the keepers of what remained, the hill was more than a myth, it was a threshold. And so from the remnants of scattered kingdoms, from ruined churches with ivy-choked altars, and from coastal halls half fallen into the sea, a few quiet figures began to walk the land again. They did not wear crowns, and they did not raise banners, but they remembered. One of them was a woman named Ilen, daughter of no king, but of a family who had served as memory keepers since the old days. Her grandmother had spoken of Rugide in her youth, had whispered names in the old tongue while spinning wool beside the fire. Ilen had never seen a court, nor heard the horns of battle, but she knew the words to call the ancient ones, and as the world grew more silent around her, she began to feel it too, the pull of the hill. Another was a weathered man called Cadden, who had once been a monk near Carlisle before the plague scattered his brethren. He had taken to wandering the edge of the wall, carrying with him a small worn book of prayers in Latin, and a carved token of the god his people had once feared before they learned to love. He too felt the pull, not as a call of faith, but of duty, to something older than even Rome. The land was not speaking with one voice, but many, and so they came, slowly, quietly, from across the Hen Ogledd. They made their way toward the hill. The journey was not marked by confrontation. These were not the days of armies, but of remembering. Where once 100 warriors might have fought to hold a valley, now a single traveler might walk it alone, unchallenged. The world had grown quieter, in some ways gentler, in other ways more dangerous, for the silence could deceive. In the ruins of old villas and the half-buried remains of Roman outposts, shadowed figures sometimes stirred, bands of dispossessed men, neither Briton nor Saxon, survivors of a time that had no place for them. They watched the travelers pass, saying nothing but never far behind. As Ilan reached the edge of the old forest once known as Caledonia, she found the trees thicker than they had been in her grandmother's tales. The road had long since disappeared, devoured by root and time. But she pressed on, guided not by path, but by memory. Her feet followed the line her ancestors had taken when the kingdom still stood, a pilgrim's track older than the maps. And one night, under a sky silvered by cloudlight and veiled stars, she found the hill. It was not large. From a distance it looked like any other rise in the moor, grassy, wind-blown, scattered with stones. But as she climbed it, the air changed. There was a stillness, and beneath that, a hum, not sound, exactly a resonance, the way a stone sometimes vibrates when held to a deep note. And there, in the side of the hill, half hidden by turf and shadow, she found the entrance. It was no grand portal, no carved arch or engraved gate, just a narrow opening, just tall enough to stoop through. And as she passed into the earth, the light behind her faded, and the old dark took her in. What lay inside was not a tomb, not exactly. There were no bones, no treasures, no remnants of offerings, just space, long winding chambers carved by ancient hands, their purpose forgotten. But the air was thick with presence. She could feel them, the kings who had walked before her, the voices not raised in command, but in song, the grief of old wars, the love of old lands. And then she heard it, not with her ears, but within, a name, spoken not in any tongue she had been taught, but one she somehow understood, Reged, and then another, Urien. Then, silence, not the silence of absence, the silence of listening. The hill was listening to her, and she knew what she had to do. Outside, the wind shifted. Others would come, Cadden, the others, the remnants of the line, not to raise a new kingdom, but to remember one that had never truly died. And as dawn began to rise, painting the hills in grey and gold, the first light touched the mouth of the Hill of Echoes. It had begun again. The shadows of the hills, as the quiet breath of night settles over the hills of the Old North, the mist rises again, weaving its way through the ancient stone ruins and crumbling fortifications. The world here is untouched by the haste of modern times, where the air still carries the weight of centuries. Beneath the stars, everything seems to hold its breath, waiting for the stories to continue. There are places in the world where time seems to fold in on itself, where the past and present are so close, they touch without you even realizing. And here in these windswept hills and valleys, the echoes of those who walked before still ring clear in the silence. The old tales, some half forgotten, others nearly lost, whisper in the cool evening breeze, beckoning the curious, the wanderers, the dreamers. It's in the silence of these hills that the true spirit of the Old North can be felt. It was a place where kingdoms rose and fell, where men fought not just for land, but for the very essence of their identity, their history, their culture. The names of those who shaped this land have long since faded from common memory, yet their legacies remain, etched into the landscape like hidden runes waiting to be deciphered. One such legacy lies in the forgotten strongholds, the quiet ruins scattered across the moors, some barely more than outlines in the fog. These were once the hearts of great kingdoms, now shadows of their former selves. The people who built them lived by a different rhythm, one attuned to the land and the sky. They built not just for the present, but for eternity, with stone and earth that would outlast them. Yet, no matter how mighty they were in life, time is a relentless force. But even as the world changes around them, there's something that refuses to be erased. The stories of the old kings, the warriors, the bards and the seers, they still live in the hills, the rivers and the winds. And tonight we listen to another chapter of their tale. For in this land, the lines between life and death, past and present, are blurred. The walls of the past seem to shift and bend, offering glimpses into forgotten lives. And so, as we walk through this land, we step softly, as if treading on sacred ground. For these hills hold secrets, some waiting to be uncovered, others best left undisturbed. In the quiet hours of the night, when the stars are low and the moon is but a thin sliver in the sky, the sound of footsteps can sometimes be heard. Not the footsteps of the living, but of those who once walked here long ago. They are the footsteps of the kings and warriors of old, the ones who shaped this land with their swords, their words, and their dreams. They linger in the corners of this world, caught between the echoes of the past and the whispers of the future. Tonight, as we sit here under the vast open sky, we find ourselves drawn into their story once again. A story that, despite the passage of time, still resonates in the quiet of the night. And though we may never know the full extent of their lives or their struggles, we feel their presence in every gust of wind, every rustle of the leaves, and every distant cry of the night birds. For the Old North is not just a place, it is a memory that refuses to fade, that refuses to be lost to time. And as long as we are willing to listen, it will always have a place in our hearts. So let the night fall deeper still, let the stories of the past swirl around us like the mist, carrying us gently toward the land of dreams. For as we rest here, beneath the quiet gaze of the stars, we are part of this eternal story. And in the silence, we too become a part of the Old North. Beneath the stars of the Old North, the darkness deepens, a velvet cloak that covers the hills and valleys of the Old North. Here, the land speaks in a language older than the kingdoms that once stood, a language of wind and stone, of moss-covered ruins and silent hills. Underneath the weight of the stars, the world seems still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something long forgotten to stir. The night sky is so vast here, untouched by the lights of distant cities, that it seems to stretch on forever. The constellations, too, are ancient, and their stories are as old as the land itself. To the people who once called this place home, the stars were not just distant points of light, they were guides, marking the path between life and death, between earth and the heavens. The Old North, it seemed, had always been a place caught between worlds. The world of men, with their ambitions and their empires, and the world of something older, something untamable. The gods of the old ways had once walked this land, or so the stories said, their footsteps felt in the rustling of the trees, in the sound of thunder across the hills, in the quiet hum of the earth beneath your feet. It is easy, in a place like this, to feel the presence of the past, not as something distant, but as something that lives within the landscape, within the very air you breathe. Every stone, every broken wall, every turn in the path seems to whisper the name of something that no longer exists. A king, a battle, a hero lost to time. And yet, even though the land seems to hold its secrets close, the stories still find their way through the cracks. They slip past the years, through the layers of earth and time, and into the hearts of those who still listen. For the Old North is a place that calls out to those who are willing to hear it, those who are willing to walk its silent paths, who are willing to sit in the stillness and let the stories come to them. Tonight, we find ourselves drawn into another chapter of the Old North's tale. It is a story that begins with the same quiet hum of the earth beneath us, the same whispers carried on the wind. But this story is different. This is the tale of a place lost to the mists of time, a place that no map can show, and no history book can record. It is the story of a forgotten kingdom, one that once stood at the very edge of the known world, a kingdom whose name has slipped from memory, but whose presence still lingers in the landscape. A kingdom of warriors and bards, of kings and seers, all bound together by a single, unbreakable thread. The name of the kingdom, like so many others of the Old North, is lost, but in the hills and valleys, the remnants of its people remain. The echoes of their voices can still be heard in the rustling of the leaves, in the creaking of ancient trees, in the distant sound of rushing water. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear the call of something ancient, something that once was, but never truly faded away. This kingdom, this place was not built in the grand style of the southern kingdoms. It was a place born from necessity, born from the wilds and the rugged landscapes of the north. It was a kingdom of survival, of resilience, where the people lived not for luxury, but for the simple raw joy of life itself. And yet, even here, there were kings. There were leaders who stood tall and proud, who looked across the land they ruled and dreamed of something more. Their names, like the kingdom itself, have been lost to time. But the stories of their deeds, their bravery, their wisdom, their folly, still echo in the hills. In the quiet of the night, under the endless sky, we hear the faintest stirrings of these stories. They begin as whispers, barely perceptible, but they grow louder as we listen. The kingdom's story unfolds slowly, like the turning of a weathered page. And as the night deepens, we are drawn further into the tale, eager to know what happened to the kingdom that no longer exists, what caused it to fall, what events led to its fading into the mist. And as we sit beneath the stars, the answers come, not all at once, but in pieces, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The Forgotten Crown. The fire crackles softly in the distance, its warmth barely reaching the edge of the hills, but its glow casts long shadows over the land. The darkness feels heavier now, as if something ancient is stirring beneath the earth, waiting to be remembered. The Old North has a way of drawing you in, of making you feel both small and significant at the same time, as if you are a part of something far older than you could ever comprehend. Tonight, as the wind whispers through the trees and the stars watch silently overhead, we find ourselves at the heart of the Forgotten Kingdom. The stones of the old walls stand in defiance of time, cracked and weathered but still proud, as if daring the centuries to erase them. These were the walls of a kingdom that had once flourished, a place where kings ruled and warriors fought, where the pulse of life beat in every stone, every tree, every drop of water in the streams that cut through the land. But that was long ago. The kingdom is gone now, its people lost to the mists of time, and yet its story remains, preserved in the very earth itself. The names of the kings and queens, the warriors and the bards have faded from memory, but their legacy endures in the wind, in the echo of footsteps long gone, in the songs that were sung around the fires at the heart of the kingdom. It was once a place of power, of influence, but its power came not from wealth or military might. No, this kingdom's strength lay in its unity, in the bond between its people and the land they called home. It was a place where every person, from the lowliest farmer to the highest noble, had a role to play in the survival of the kingdom. They were bound together by the land, by the very soil that fed them, and the waters that sustained them. Now, however, those waters have grown still, and the land bears only the faintest signs of the people who once lived here. The land has a different kind of beauty now, one that comes from age, from a long slumber. The trees stand taller than they ever did in the time of the kingdom, their roots running deeper, as if they too remember a time when men walked these hills, when the fires in the hearths burned brighter, when the songs of the kingdom filled the air. But the winds, though they may sound the same as they did centuries ago, feel different now. They carry a weight with them, a history that cannot be fully understood. But that history, the rise and fall of the kingdom, is not easily forgotten. It lives in the whispers of the earth, in the very fabric of this place. The land remembers even if the people have long since passed away. The stories of the kingdom are not told through books or scrolls, nor are they written in stone. Instead, they are carried on the breath of the land itself, passed down in the rustling of the leaves, in the patterns of the clouds, in the deep hum of the earth beneath your feet. It is here, in the silence of the night, where the past comes alive once more. There are places in this world where time seems to stand still. This forgotten kingdom is one of those places. It is as though the kingdom has been frozen in time, locked away in a moment that cannot be erased. Here the echoes of the past are as present as the ground beneath our feet, and every step we take feels like a journey back in time. But where did it all go? Where did the people go? Where did the life that once thrived in the kingdom disappear to? These are questions without answers, questions that may never be answered, for some mysteries, like the ones buried here in the Old North, are meant to remain unsolved. As we stand in the shadow of the crumbling walls, we feel the weight of history pressing down on us. The ruins of the kingdom tell their own story, one of grandeur, of life, of power. But they also speak of loss, of the slow erosion of something that was once great. The walls are cracked, the stonework crumbling, but they are still standing, and for all their decay, there is something undeniably beautiful in their ruins, something hauntingly captivating about the way they stand, stoic against the winds of time. The king who once ruled here, his name is unknown, his face is lost to history, but there is something in the air tonight that speaks of him, as if the very land remembers him still. The weight of his reign lingers, even if no one alive today can recall his deeds. The wind, when it howls through the ruins, seems to carry his presence with it, as though the king is still watching, still waiting for his people to return. What kind of king was he? What were his dreams, his fears, his passions? Did he ever imagine that his kingdom would fall to dust, that his name would be forgotten? It's easy to imagine him standing at the edge of these same hills, watching the same winds blow through the trees, perhaps pondering his own future, never suspecting that one day the kingdom he ruled would fade into nothingness. And yet, there is no grand story of his downfall, no dramatic battle that led to the kingdom's demise. There was no single event that brought it to its knees. Instead, the kingdom faded slowly, imperceptibly, like the ebbing of a tide, quietly slipping into the past, forgotten by all but the land itself. It is said that every kingdom leaves behind a legacy, a mark upon the world that can never be erased. Perhaps this kingdom left behind more than just stone walls and forgotten roads. Perhaps it left behind something that cannot be measured, something that can only be felt. The people who lived here, their lives were not without meaning. They were connected to something greater than themselves, something timeless and enduring. As we walk among the ruins tonight, we are reminded of the fragility of life, of the fleeting nature of all things. The wind whispers softly in the trees, as if to remind us that nothing lasts forever, not even kingdoms. Yet, even as the old walls crumble, and the shadows lengthen, there is a strange comfort in the knowledge that the kingdom, though gone, still lingers here. The past, though it may fade into nothingness, never truly disappears. It lives on, in the very air we breathe, in the soil beneath our feet, in the stones that still stand, weathered and worn but proud. The truth is, this kingdom, though forgotten, is not truly lost. It is still here, in the land, in the earth, in the bones of the old walls, and perhaps that is enough. As we leave the ruins behind, and continue our journey through the hills, the stars overhead seem to watch over us, as if guiding us along the same path that the people of the kingdom once walked. Their footsteps, long since faded, seem to echo in our minds, and the faintest whisper of their voices drifts on the wind. Perhaps one day, someone will return to this place, and the kingdom will rise again, at least in their stories, in their memories. Perhaps the old walls will stand once more, as they did in days long past, and the crown that was once worn by a forgotten king will once again rest upon the brow of a ruler who will lead the kingdom back into the light. But for now, the land sleeps, the fire burns low, and the story of the forgotten kingdom drifts, like a dream, into the quiet of the night. The hearth, in the stones. By the time the last of the embers faded in the watchfires, a hush had returned to the high valley where the remnants of the old warband had taken shelter. The snows had not yet returned, but the air carried that stillness, the breathless quiet that settles just before winter tightens its grip on the land. In the half-dark of morning, a pale light stretched across the damp grass and mossy stones, as if the hills themselves were waking reluctantly from long-forgotten dreams. Idwal sat cross-legged by a crumbling wall, what once might have been a sheepfold or even a Roman outbuilding, holding the fragment of a broken torque in his hand. The bronze was green with age and rough where the band had split, but the etchings were still visible, spirals and notches, tiny dots that seemed to map a language lost to everyone but the stones. He wasn't alone. The bard Aneurin, now old and slow but still sharp in his thoughts, joined him quietly, settling on a flat stone opposite. Between them, the remains of the morning's fire clung to life, barely a flicker, more warmth in memory than flame. "They say this land never forgets," Aneurin murmured, his voice a worn whisper, made soft by time and travel. "I used to think that was just a tale to frighten children, but now, I wonder." Idwal looked up. "You mean the ghosts?" Aneurin smiled, lines gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Not ghosts, lad, something quieter than that. Echoes, shadows, the shape of something gone, still shaping what's left." They had marched far, farther than most would dare. From Raged's vanished heartland to the windswept ridges of what had once been the edge of Elmet. Behind them were old paths, carved out long before memory, walked by Roman soldiers and cattle drovers, kings and wanderers. The roads, though cracked and overgrown, had held their feet well enough, and always, along the way there were signs, markers of stories left untold. A standing stone here, a broken altar there, whispers in the form of place names, oddly shaped hills, sudden silences in the trees, and now, at the edge of a forgotten settlement, nestled between the shoulders of the Pennines, they paused, just long enough to listen, just long enough to remember. The village they had stumbled across was empty, and had been for generations. Long roofs of heather, that had once covered roundhouses, were now lost to collapse, their timbers swallowed by soil. But something still clung to the place, a shape in the ruins, as if those who lived here had only recently stepped away. Idwal found it oddly comforting. He'd expected the Old North to be lonelier. While the others tended to horses or checked packs, Aneurin began to speak, slowly at first, then with more surety as the old rhythm came back to him. Not a song this time, but a tale. It was a tale of a firelit hall, long ago, deep in the valley beneath them, of a chief called Dunwall and his daughter Gwyneth, who was said to have had the gift of foresight. She had once stood in that very hall, and predicted the fall of the Roman roads, the splitting of the kingdoms, and the coming of a man with no crown who would carry the memory of the old ways on his back. A prophecy, Idwal said, not sure whether to scoff or believe. "Perhaps," said Aneurin, leaning closer to the weak fire, "or maybe just someone reading the winds right. People forget how good we once were at that." The tale wound on slowly, gently. It told of Gwyneth's journey, of how she walked the length of the land with a group of loyal followers, how she buried knowledge in cairns and inscribed warnings on stones, and how, when she died, it was said a single stone turned to face west, toward the sea, and has never turned back since. There was no proof, of course, just story. But in the stillness of the ruined village, with mist rising and birds silent, the tale seemed no less real than the talk in Idwal's hands. The others returned by evening, some with news distant riders spotted, uncertain if friend or foe, some with silence, carrying only the weight of being too long on the road. They made camp that night among the ruins, and though no one said it aloud, something about the place felt safe, sheltered, as if even the wind had agreed to keep its voice low. As sleep took them, one by one, Inarin remained awake. He was tracing the outlines of the old stories in his head, preparing them for the next fire, the next night, the next hilltop. For this was the task now, not to win back a lost kingdom, not to light another wall, but to remember, to carry the ember of a world slipping into silence, and offer it, quietly, to those still willing to listen. And somewhere in the valley, where no man saw, and no bird cried out, a single standing stone faced west, just as the story had said. The Watchers, on the crag. The mist clung to the upper slopes like an old friend, familiar and unmoving, softening the jagged outline of the crags above. It was morning, or perhaps close to it, though the sky remained the color of slate, and somewhere in that dimness, as always in the north, the past waited. The ridge where the path now wound had no name on modern maps, but in earlier days it had been known simply as the Watcher's Rise, a place of vigil where lookouts stood through the seasons, watching for riders in the lowlands, or beacon fires flaring in the dark. From here one could see far across the broken spine of the Pennines, into the valleys below where villages had come and gone like smoke, and it was said that on certain nights, when the wind came in from the Irish Sea just right, the voices of the Watchers could still be heard, murmuring from the stones. After the fall of the last great halls in the Eden Valley, and the fading of Rigid into Story, this place had become a kind of threshold. Few passed through here without reason, fewer still returned. For the lands on the far side of the ridge were stranger still, touched not just by the war and famine of men, but by the half-remembered forces the Britons once feared, ancient presences woven into the hills and water. It was into this twilight world that a lone traveller now moved. He was older than most who walked the old roads these days, wrapped in wool and silence, carrying little beyond a worn satchel and a staff. His boots were patched and weather-beaten, but his steps were steady. He had come from the south, though few knew it, from the remains of what had once been a monastery tucked deep in the hills, where old words were still whispered and older songs still sung. He was not searching for anything, not precisely, but he had heard tales half buried, half true, that in the shadow of the Watcher's Rise, there still remained a place where something of the old knowledge lingered. A chapel perhaps, or a hidden archive buried in the roots of the stone, something untouched by flame or forgetting. And perhaps, more than knowledge, he sought memory. Back in the time of kings, real kings, not the warlords who now claimed the title, this place had belonged to neither Saxon nor Briton, but had remained untouched, watched over by those who remembered the times before either. Men and women who did not carry swords but songs. Some called them druids, though the name had long gone out of use. Others called them nothing at all, for they had faded into the hills like deer at the coming of men. The traveller had once seen a tower here, or thought he had. A tall, narrow stone pillar, impossibly old, rising from a circle of standing stones. But when he'd returned years later, the tower was gone. Only moss-covered shapes and a scattering of sheep remained. And yet, he walked still. The wind tugged at his cloak, and behind him the clouds shifted in long, slow waves across the sky. The birds were quiet. Even the ravens had gone eastward. Below in the shadowed valley, a stream whispered over stones older than any memory. The traveller paused beside it, kneeled, let the water run through his fingers, cold, clean, ancient. He thought of a story he had once heard, spoken in a crumbling hall by a bard with no teeth, his voice like rustling leaves. It had been about this place, about the Watchers on the crag, who never aged and never left, who waited always for the return of a forgotten king. A king not of armies, but of silence. A king who ruled not from a throne, but from memory. Foolishness, perhaps, but sometimes, the oldest stories are not the loudest. He continued on. As the day wore on, or at least, as the grey light shifted in that timeless northern way, he came upon an outcrop of stone, unlike the rest. It stood too straight, too clean, worn down by wind and rain, yes, but clearly worked by hand. He brushed away the moss. Beneath it, carved lines, letters, not Latin, not Saxon runes, but the old tongue. He traced them slowly, a name, not his, but familiar. He sat down beside the stone, and opened the satchel. From it he drew a worn bundle of parchment, and a small horn flask. He drank sparingly, ate a little bread, and began to write, not for anyone living, but so the memory would not vanish, not entirely. And above him, far above, the Watchers waited still, perhaps not people anymore, not truly, but something older, something that remembered. Night came gently, folding the hills in its arms. Far below, in the long-forgotten hollows of the land, tiny fires flickered once again. This was not the end of the world, not quite, but it was the place where the world had ended once before, and perhaps would again. For now, though, there was only wind, and memory, and the sound of one man's pen scratching gently on the parchment, writing by the light of the last grey hour. The Hollow Crown. By the time the first frost settled on the empty fields beyond the river, the men who once gathered beneath the old banners of Rajed were gone. Not all of them had fallen to sword or famine. Some had simply vanished into the land, taking their stories with them. Others, broken by the weight of the years, had returned to their homesteads, burying their weapons in the cold earth, as if the war had never happened. The hall at Caer Dathel, once alive with voices and the clatter of feasting, now stood silent, its great fire hearth darkened, its roof sagging under the damp. Only a few scattered souls lingered there, holding fast to what little remained of their old order, still watching the hills for a banner that would never rise again. Yet the land itself had not forgotten. And in the borderlands between Rajed's shadow and the fractured edge of Elmet, there still moved a figure cloaked not in power, but in memory. His name was never recorded, or if it was, the records were lost with the monks who fled the sacking of their libraries. But those who told stories at night called him the Hollow King, a man who had once been a prince, or perhaps only a servant, who walked the empty roads seeking something no one could name. They said he carried with him the broken hilt of a sword, not as a weapon, but as a memory. That he had served at Caer Dathel before the end. That he had witnessed the last council, when Urien's heirs quarrelled beneath tapestries depicting their father's victories, and that in the silence that followed the collapse, he had chosen to walk. Through rain and fog and the hush of falling snow, he made his way from ruin to ruin, never speaking of his past, asking only for shelter and water. Those who welcomed him sometimes found coins of Roman silver left behind when he departed, though none could say how he came by them. Others swore he whispered names in his sleep, ancient names, long forgotten, names of rivers, kings and battles never written down. It was said he walked with dreams, and that the dreams were not his own. As he moved northward, stories began to swirl around him, blending truth with tale, as they so often did in the Old North. Some believed he sought the last fortress of the Britons, a place untouched by the wars of Saxon and Scot, hidden deep within the hills beyond the wall. Others thought he was cursed, condemned to wander until the land itself was healed. But for those who lived quietly in the valleys and forests, growing turnips in Roman fields and watching the stars from crumbling tower houses, he was something else entirely, a sign that the story was not yet over. In the far west, in the hills of what was once Strathclyde, the Hollow King passed through a village nestled beneath a great stone outcrop. There, an old woman with failing eyes and perfect memory told him a story in the language of her youth, a tale of a golden cup hidden in a cave beneath the mountains, guarded by a river that flowed backwards. She said the cup was once carried by a saint or a king, no one could remember which, and that it held the power to heal a broken land. The Hollow King listened, and when morning came, he was gone again. Over time, his wanderings left more than footprints. He carried memories from place to place, stitching together fragments of a broken world, and in his passing, a kind of quiet hope began to take root. Not the hope of armies or kings, but something older, deeper, a hope born of memory, because by then, even the great monasteries of the West had begun to change. No longer merely the keepers of Latin scripture, their scribes were now collecting stories, bardic songs, local legends, half-heard whispers from shepherds who spoke in tongues no longer understood. The Hollow King, or the idea of him, appeared more than once in these collections. Not by name, but in signs. A stranger with a broken sword, a man who remembered too much, a man who walked the ruins not to mourn, but to remember, and still the land watched. The Roman roads he followed were now little more than suggestions, overgrown with grass and cut through by streams. The stone mile markers had long since fallen, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. But in some strange way, those same roads endured. Underneath the moss, beneath the modern tracks, the bones of empire still held the shape of a world long gone, and the Hollow King walked them all. Eventually, the stories claimed, he came to a pass between the hills, just as winter broke again. There, beneath the grey clouds, he saw a light. Not the fire of a village, nor the torch of a patrol, but a single candle, flickering in the window of an old watchtower. No one knew who lit it. No one knew what it meant. But he went toward it, and that was the last anyone saw of him. To this day, in some corners of Cumbria, it's said that when the wind is just right, and the mist hugs the ground, you can see a figure walking the hills alone, not a ghost, Not quite a man, but something in between. A bearer of memory. A thread in the long unfinished tapestry of the Old North. And perhaps, if you're very quiet, if you let yourself drift and listen with more than your ears, you might hear his footsteps, soft on the stone as he passes by. The circle beneath the hill. When the morning mist peeled away from the moors like a slow breath, it revealed not the waking world, but something that always seemed half asleep. The land up here did not rush to greet the sun. It lingered in its twilight hush, its hills rounded like the backs of sleeping giants, and its streams whispering through stones too old to name. It was here, beyond the known tracks, and outside the last lines inked on any map, that Cian and Britha found themselves riding once again. Slower now, more cautious than ever, they had left behind the broken hall of the candle, and with it, the last shadow of Lord Merrin's dwindled hold. The air still tasted of ash when they woke that morning, and neither spoke of the dream they both seemed to share, of flame without heat, of whispers without breath. Something old had stirred in that place, and it was not finished with them. The path they followed now wasn't a path at all, more a series of subtle dips in the grass, an alignment of stones that seemed too intentional to be chance. Britha, who rarely guessed at things, simply said, "We're being led," and Cian did not argue. They came to a hollow just after dusk, where the ground opened into a gentle basin. Trees ringed the edge like watchers, their roots twisting over one another as if clutching the earth beneath, and at the heart of the hollow was a hill, round, low, and perfectly smooth. No trees grew on it, no flowers bloomed, just a single standing stone barely the height of a man, leaning slightly as though listening for a sound only the earth could hear. Cian dismounted first. He felt the air change as his boots touched the soil. It wasn't colder, not exactly, but it carried a weight, a memory perhaps, a heaviness that didn't frighten, but didn't comfort either. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Britha only nodded, and together they walked the gentle slope toward the stone. It was carved, not clearly, not like Roman chiseling or the crisp strokes of later hands. These were softer marks, curves within curves, as though someone had drawn water into stone, spirals, circles, loops that had no beginning and no clear end, symbols that might have meant nothing, or everything. Britha placed her palm on the surface. "It's a boundary," she whispered, "not of land, but of time." That night, they made camp on the edge of the hollow. The fire they built was small, and they spoke little. The world around them was hushed, but not asleep. The trees creaked softly, though there was no wind. Small stones shifted at the base of the mound, though no creature passed. And sometime before the moon rose, the ground began to hum. It was not a sound you could hear with your ears, but one that stirred in the chest and behind the eyes. A frequency older than song, older than speech. Cian sat up, not out of fear, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. He looked to Britha, who was already awake, eyes fixed on the hill. From within it, a soft light began to bleed through the grass. Not firelight, not lantern glow. A color that didn't belong to daylight or night, something of the dawn but untouched by sun. "The circle is opening," Britha said, her voice barely above breath, and then a figure, not emerging but appearing, as though it had always been there and only now chose to be seen. Human-shaped, but not quite human. Tall, robed in moss-colored cloth, face hidden beneath a shadow that moved with it. Around its waist, a ring of small objects, bones, feathers, stones shaped by time. It walked the ring around the stone, never touching it. The earth did not crunch beneath its feet, the leaves did not shift, yet Cian felt its presence with such certainty that it made the hairs on his arms rise. Britha did not move. The figure stopped, and raised one arm, not in threat, but in invitation. And Cian understood, not with his mind, but with something older inside him. This hill was not a place of death. It was a place of remembering, a vault, a vessel, a gate, and what lay beyond was not just the past, but the memory of the world itself. The figure stepped back, fading not into the hill but into the space behind it, as though folding into another page of the same book. The hum faded, the light dimmed, and silence returned. Neither of them slept after that, not because they were afraid, but because they knew they had seen something sacred. By dawn, the hill looked the same as it always had. The standing stone leaned, the trees watched, and the mist began its slow return. They left the hollow with quiet steps, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And as they vanished into the folds of the land, the circle beneath the hill waited once more, for the next who would listen. The river that watched, The mist had not lifted since dawn, and by the time the company reached the riverbank, the world felt strangely distant, wrapped in silence and grey light. The river alone, broad, sluggish, and heavy with rain, moved with the slow patience of something that had seen too much and forgotten little. Its waters shimmered with the sheen of old memories, carrying silt from distant hills and the voices of long-vanished peoples. Sinfulin paused at the edge of the bank, his boots pressing into the soft black mud. Behind him, Idris reined in his horse, the animal restless and breath visible in the damp air. Neither of them spoke, for there was a tension here that did not need words, a sense that they were not alone. Not truly. Somewhere in the reeds, a curlew called out with a melancholy cry, and the sound seemed to echo forever. It was here, the old man at the last hall had said, the crossing that did not appear on maps, the one used by the warbands of Rigid when they moved at night to avoid Roman eyes. It was a place known only to those who remembered the land as it had been, before lines on paper and names carved in Latin. There, Idris said finally, pointing to the remains of what may once have been a stone abutment half buried in moss and earth. A narrow path led toward it, overgrown but still there. Sinfulin nodded. This was the way. As they moved down the path, ducking beneath branches and stepping carefully over the roots that curled like sleeping snakes, Idris spoke again, more softly this time. "Do you think she's still ahead of us?" Sinfulin didn't answer right away. He had been wondering the same. Eira, daughter of Idion, last of a forgotten hill fort in Elmet, had vanished with a purpose, following the same trail of clues and old songs that had led them here. She moved like someone born of the mist itself, half story and half truth, and the more they followed her path, the more it felt like following a ghost. "She knows the rivers," Sinfulin said at last. "She knows the land better than we do. If she wants us to catch her, we will. And if she doesn't, then we'll learn something else along the way." They reached the crossing just as the sky darkened with the hint of approaching rain. The river widened here, broken by flat stones that sat just beneath the surface, their slippery backs showing above the water like the spines of old beasts resting. A single wooden post remained on the far side, weather-worn and leaning, with a sigil barely legible carved into its surface. A wolf's head, or perhaps a dragon. It was hard to tell in the dim light. They crossed slowly, 1 foot at a time, the water rising nearly to their knees at the deepest point. Every step sent ripples outward, as though disturbing something ancient that preferred to sleep undisturbed. By the time they reached the far bank, the world seemed even quieter than before. There was a village once, not far from here. Sinfulin remembered hearing of it. Carried Glas, the grey rock. It had been abandoned centuries before, after a sickness came up the river and took everything with it. No one lived there now, not even the desperate. But some still said they saw smoke from its hearths in the deepest winter. Ghost fires, dreams that wandered. Whatever was left of Carried Glas, it was just over the hill. They moved on, driven not just by the need to find Eira, but by something deeper, an unease that came from knowing they were walking not through a landscape, but through a memory. Every broken wall, every leaning tree, every curve of the river carried meaning. Stories they didn't yet know, waiting to be remembered. As twilight deepened, they reached the edge of the old village. It was a place caught in a moment. The ruins hadn't crumbled entirely. Stone walls still stood waist-high, doors without roofs, hearths open to the sky. Ivy crept through everything. Nature had moved in, but not to erase. It seemed more like the land was holding it in place, preserving the echo. They found shelter in what had once been a weaver's home, judging by the old loom still rotting in the corner. They lit a small fire and sat close. Neither spoke of the whispering they heard outside once the sun went down, or the sound of a bell that rang once, faintly, with no source. Idris dozed first, head tilted back, breathing soft and even. Sinfulin stayed awake longer, watching the shadows, and then, in the deepest part of the night, she appeared. No sound, no warning, just the rustle of a cloak, and the gleam of a firelit brooch. Eira stood in the doorway, eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. "You're close," she said, voice calm, quiet. "But it's not over the next hill, it's deeper." Sinfulin didn't ask how she'd found them. He simply nodded. "We're ready." She stepped aside, letting the wind speak for her. And just like that, the path ahead opened once more. The murmurs of Dwenid. The wind had softened by the time Cian and Edwin passed through the lower valleys, where the hills no longer rose like jagged teeth, but smoothed into gentle slopes, clothed in damp heather and fern. The trail beneath their feet, scarcely more than a deer path, followed the line of an ancient stream, its waters sluggish now, but wide, as though remembering when they had once flooded valleys and carved through stone. They were following the old Dywenid, the river that once marked a boundary between two forgotten kingdoms. It was said to whisper to those who wandered near its banks, and though Edwin didn't speak it aloud, she had heard it. The quiet murmur of something not quite water, not quite wind. Stories, maybe, echoes of what had been. By now the road to Caper Treba had vanished entirely behind them. The warband had dispersed to the north and west, each man taking word of the crumbling alliances, the shifting loyalties, and the fate of Rigeged. But Cian had not followed them. His path led deeper, toward a place no one had spoken of in years, where the old druids were said to have buried the last relics of the Flame Keepers. "You're certain it's here?" Edwin asked, as they made camp beneath a leaning birch, its branches skeletal against the late winter sky. "I'm not certain of anything," Cian admitted, "only that my father told me once, that if everything was lost I should go to the river, that the river remembers." She didn't ask what he meant. In the days since they had left the remnants of the hall, she had learned that silence sometimes held more truth than questions. Instead she placed a ring of smooth stones around the small fire they built, and stared into the flames as dusk crept slowly over the hills. The first night by the river passed uneventfully, until the dreams began. Cian woke just before dawn, cold despite the fire, with the echo of a voice fading in his ears. Not Edwin's, not his own. Something older, deeper. It had whispered only a name he had not heard since childhood. Myrddin. He looked across the fire to Edwin, who was still curled in her cloak, yet her face was tight with unease, even in sleep, and he wondered if she'd heard the same voice. They continued on, following the twists of the Dywenid, as it narrowed and wove into a forest denser than any they had yet crossed. The canopy here let in little light, moss hung thick from branches, and every footfall seemed to stir something in the undergrowth, though they never saw it. Here, the world felt suspended, like it had slipped slightly sideways from the rest of time. And then, on the third day, they found it. It was not a town, not even a ruin, just a single stone, standing upright in a clearing where the river bent sharply north. It was carved, though time had worn away most of the marks, but a spiral still remained, deep and deliberate, as though it had been meant to last forever. "This is it," Cian said, more to himself than to Edwin. The air was very still. No birds sang here. Edwin placed her hand on the stone, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, from the trees beyond, a rustling, not the wind, not an animal, someone, or something, approaching with purpose. Cian drew his blade, but Edwin stopped him. "We're meant to listen," she said, and so they stood, still as the stone, as a voice, not from the woods, but from within their minds, began to speak. It told them of a time before the kingdoms, before even Rome, when the rivers were roads, and the stars were read like books, when Myrddin was not yet mad, but a watcher of the world. It told them of a fire kept beneath the earth, and a word passed down in secret. It did not tell them what to do next. When it ended, they were alone again. The forest was unchanged. The wind stirred the leaves. The river kept moving. But something had shifted, not just in the land, but in them. And as they turned to leave the clearing, Cian no longer felt lost. He did not know where the path led, but he knew it was the one he was meant to follow. The return of the whisper. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy above, casting soft, dappled patterns across the ground. Cian and Edwin moved quietly. Their steps no longer hurried, as if the forest itself had slowed their pace, urging them to linger in the stillness. The air felt heavy, thick with the whispers of the past, the kind of whispers that seemed to echo not from the trees, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. The stone they had found still stood behind them, but now it seemed far less significant. Its carved spiral, once so mysterious, now felt like only a beginning, a clue, a hint of something larger that lay beneath the surface of their world, waiting to be uncovered. It was as though the forest itself had shared a secret with them, a secret they were meant to carry forward. "You feel it, don't you?" Edwin asked, her voice low, almost reverent. Cian nodded, though he hadn't spoken a word since the vision, or whatever it had been, had ended. He had no name for it. There was no way to explain the sense that the land around them was alive, breathing, listening. It was as though the earth itself had recognized them, and in return had given them a piece of its memory. They moved deeper into the forest, their journey taking them along the winding path of the Derwined, which now seemed more like a guide than a simple river. It beckoned them forward, as though it knew the way even when they did not. After hours of silent walking, the forest began to thin, revealing a valley that stretched far below them. The river split here, breaking into several branches, each winding through the hills in delicate curves. At the heart of the valley, a massive hill rose, its peak shrouded in mist. Kian stopped at the edge of the forest and gazed out over the land. His chest tightened as a strange familiarity washed over him. He had never been here before, yet the place felt known, like something buried deep within him was stirring, urging him forward. "There," he said, pointing toward the hill. "That's where we need to go." Edwin, who had been staring at the same hill, nodded. "It's where the river's going. We should follow." They descended into the valley, the path uneven beneath their feet. The river's water was cold and clear, flowing gently over smooth stones, and as they followed it toward the hill, they passed remnants of old settlements, stone foundations, broken walls, and weathered carvings that hinted at a time long past. But no one lived here now. The land was empty, save for the wind and the whispers of forgotten souls. The closer they came to the hill, the more intense the feeling grew, like an ancient presence, watching, waiting. Kian's heart beat faster. Every step seemed to draw him closer to something he couldn't name, but something that felt incredibly important. His fingers tingled, as though a current of energy was running through the earth beneath him, connecting him to a forgotten power. At the base of the hill, a small clearing opened up, and in the center stood an ancient structure, what could only be described as a tomb. Its stones were covered in moss, and vines hung thick from its sides. But it wasn't the structure that caught their attention. It was the light. The light came from within. Kian and Edwin stood motionless, staring at the faint glow that emanated from cracks in the stone. It was not the soft flickering light of fire, but something more ethereal, almost otherworldly, as if the tomb itself were alive, breathing in time with the land around them. The air felt charged, the very earth humming beneath their feet. Kian stepped forward, and the ground seemed to pulse with each footfall, guiding him toward the tomb. His heart raced, but he couldn't stop now. Whatever lay ahead was part of the journey, part of the path that had begun so long ago, when the first whispers reached him at the river. When he reached the tomb, he placed his hand against the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, the glow intensified, bathing him in a soft golden light. The ground trembled slightly beneath him, and for a moment, everything went silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the soft hum of the earth itself. And then, through the silence, a voice whispered. Not in words but in a feeling, a sense of knowing, of recognition. It was the same voice Kian had heard at the river, the voice that had called his name, that had spoken of Myrddin, and the path he must walk. "Open it," the voice whispered, clear and strong now, though no one else was near. Kian felt the urge to obey, to release whatever had been sealed within these stones. He stepped back, taking in the full shape of the tomb. There was no door, no obvious way in, but as he reached out to touch the stone again, a section of the tomb shifted, a seam appearing where none had been before. With a low groan, the stone slid aside, revealing a dark interior. The air that emerged from the tomb was cool, but it carried with it the scent of earth and ancient fire. Edwin stepped forward, her hand resting on Kian's shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low and uncertain. Kian met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had no answers, only the overwhelming certainty that this was the right path. Whatever lay inside this tomb, it was meant for him. It was a part of the story that had been written long before his birth, long before any of them had come to this land. With one final glance at Edwin, Kian stepped into the tomb. The secret within. The air inside the tomb was cold, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of cold that seemed to settle deep into the bones, an ancient chill that carried whispers of centuries past. The dim light from the crack in the stone illuminated the chamber just enough to reveal its eerie quietness. There was no sign of life here, no insects, no echoes of footsteps, only a profound stillness, as if the tomb itself had been waiting for something or someone to arrive. Tien moved cautiously, feeling the weight of the silence around him. His hand brushed against the walls as he walked deeper into the tomb, following the faint glow that seemed to pulse from somewhere deep within. Every step he took reverberated through the ground, the low hum of the earth vibrating beneath his feet. It was almost as if the very ground was alive, sensing his presence, guiding him forward. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, and with it, the strange pull that had drawn Cien here only grew stronger. Edwin had followed him, albeit more reluctantly, and was now just a few steps behind. Her gaze darted nervously around, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows, but nothing moved, nothing stirred. Finally they reached the heart of the tomb, a small chamber bathed in a pale, ethereal light. At the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, sat a large, weathered chest. It was not ornate, nor particularly grand, but it had an undeniable presence. The chest seemed to hum with an energy of its own, as if it were waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. Cien stopped in front of it, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. Whatever was inside this chest was the key to the next part of his journey, the next piece of the puzzle that had been unfolding since he first heard the whispers by the river. Without hesitating, he knelt down before the chest, his fingers brushing the surface of its cold, weathered wood. It felt like a heartbeat, pulsing beneath his touch, steady and strong. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of history, the weight of a forgotten time pressing down on him. Slowly, he lifted the lid. At first, there was only darkness. The chest was empty, or so it seemed. But as the lid fully opened, a soft glow began to emanate from within. Cien squinted, trying to make out the shape of whatever lay inside, and then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. It was a book. The book was old, ancient even, but its cover was intricately designed with symbols Cien did not recognize. The pages, though yellowed with age, seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. It was unlike any book he had ever seen, and yet, it felt so familiar, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Tentatively, Cien reached inside and lifted the book from the chest. The moment his hands touched it, a rush of images flooded his mind, visions of ancient battles, long-lost kings, and forgotten gods. He saw a land covered in mist, its people struggling to hold on to a way of life that was slipping through their fingers. He saw Myrddin, his face grave and full of sorrow, speaking words that Cien could not fully understand, and he saw the land itself, battered by time, but still alive, still remembering. Cien, Edwin whispered from behind him, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the tomb. What is it? What have you found? Cien did not answer at first. He was lost in the images, in the overwhelming sense of connection that the book seemed to offer. It was as though the very soul of the land, of the Old North, had been captured in these pages, and now it was calling to him. Finally, he tore his gaze from the book, and looked up at Edwin, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. I don't know, he said softly, but this is the key. This is what we've been searching for. With trembling hands, he opened the first page. As he did, the world around him seemed to shift. The tomb, the stone walls, even the very air seemed to change, as if the book had unlocked something deep within the earth. The glowing light around them intensified, and for a moment, everything was bathed in a brilliant white light. Cien blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, the tomb was no longer the same. It was as though they had been transported to another time, another world. The walls were no longer stone, but ancient wood, decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and feasts. The ground beneath their feet was soft, covered with rich green moss, and before them, standing tall and proud, was a figure, a man draped in a cloak of furs and iron. Cien's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man immediately. It was Myrddin. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Cien's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There was no smile, no welcoming gesture, only a deep, knowing gaze that seemed to pierce through time itself. Myrddin, Cien whispered, his voice cracking with awe. The figure nodded slowly, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. I have waited for you, Cien of the North. You have come seeking the truth, but what you seek is not what you expect. Cien opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the figure raised a hand. The truth is not a simple thing, Myrddin continued. It is not a story with a beginning and an end. It is a journey, and the path you walk will change everything. For you, for this land, for all who come after. The light around them began to fade, and the images of the past began to blur, but Myrddin's voice remained, echoing in the chambers of Cien's mind. The Old North is not gone, it is merely sleeping, and you are the one who will awaken it. The vision faded, and Cien found himself back in the tomb, standing before the open book, the words still fresh in his mind. The air was heavy again, but this time, it was filled with a sense of purpose. The journey was far from over. The awakening. Cien stood in the tomb, the air thick with the weight of what he had just witnessed. His hands trembled slightly as he held the book, the soft glow still emanating from its pages, though the brilliant light of the vision had faded. His heart beat faster. The words Myrddin had spoken, echoing through his mind, like a distant drum, reverberating through the very marrow of his bones. "The Old North is not gone," Myrddin's voice had said. "It is merely sleeping." What did that mean? What was he supposed to do now? Edwin had stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern. "Sian," she whispered, her voice low, as if not wanting to disturb the fragile silence of the tomb. "What happened? What did you see?" Sian blinked, coming back to himself, the room around him slowly coming back into focus. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I saw him," Sian said slowly, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth. "I saw Myrddin. He spoke to me, told me that the Old North is not gone, it's sleeping, and that I am the one who must awaken it." Edwin's eyes widened, but she didn't speak immediately. She let the weight of Sian's words sink in. "He told me that the truth isn't what we expect," Sian continued, his voice growing more certain with each passing moment. "It's not a story with a clear beginning and end. It's a journey, and we've only just started." They stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle over them once more. The wind outside howled faintly, almost as if it too were aware of the significance of what had just transpired within these ancient walls. "Then we must follow this path," Edwin said at last, her voice steady with resolve. "We must go further. Whatever it is that we are meant to awaken, we cannot do it by standing still." Sian nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of determination rise within him. He knew that their journey had changed. What had once been a quest for knowledge had now become something far greater, something that would affect not only their lives, but the future of the land they loved. "I agree," Sian said, "but where do we go from here? What do we do next?" Edwin turned and looked around the tomb, her gaze sweeping over the cracked walls, the stone remnants of a world long past. "The book is the key," she said thoughtfully. "It has brought us here, and it will show us the way forward. We must decipher it, understand its secrets, and let it guide us." Sian opened the book once more, carefully tracing his fingers along the pages. The words were written in a language he did not understand, but as he looked at the symbols, a strange sense of recognition washed over him. It was as though the book was speaking to him in ways he couldn't fully grasp, whispering its secrets directly into his soul. The symbols seemed to shift before his eyes, the pages folding themselves into new shapes, like a puzzle that was slowly taking form. The hum of ancient power grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him to keep going. He flipped through the pages, desperate to find something, anything, that would make sense of what he had just experienced. Then, on the very last page, something caught his eye. There, at the bottom of the page, was a small inscription. It was different from the rest of the text. The symbols were more familiar now, and as Sian's eyes scanned the words, he felt the pulse of energy that had been building within the tomb resonate once more. "The awakening begins where the rivers meet," Sian read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, "where the old stones still stand." Edwin looked at him, a flicker of realization crossing her face. The rivers, the ancient meeting places, it could be where the kingdom's heart lies. Sian nodded, closing the book with a slow, deliberate motion. He had seen it, he had felt it, the pull. It was there, just beyond their reach, waiting to be uncovered. The journey ahead would take them to places few had dared venture, to lands lost to time and history. But they were not alone. The land, the very soil beneath their feet, seemed to hum with energy, as if acknowledging their presence and their purpose. "We must go," Sian said, the urgency in his voice clear now. "The rivers, the stones, it all points to something more, and we cannot waste any more time." Without another word, Edwin nodded, her face set with determination. She turned toward the entrance of the tomb, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet air. Sian followed, the weight of the book heavy in his hands, the answers it held just beyond his grasp, but closer than ever before. Their journey had only just begun, and already it felt as though the land was speaking to them, urging them onward. As they stepped outside, the night air hit them with a sharpness that took their breath away. The sky above was filled with stars, their light twinkling like the eyes of 1,000 ancient watchers, silent and waiting. The world around them felt alive, and as they walked into the night, Sian knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, and the Old North would never be the same again. into the heart of the Old North. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Tien felt something akin to hope stir within him. The weight of the ancient book in his hands was a reminder of the promise they had made to uncover the forgotten secrets of the Old North, and that promise now seemed more vital than ever. As he walked beside Edwin, the wind at their backs carried a sense of urgency, a whispering reminder that time was of the essence. There were mysteries waiting to be revealed, and they could not afford to waste a moment. They traveled through the night, the moonlight guiding their way across the rugged terrain. The landscape of the Old North, once distant and unfamiliar, now felt more like an old friend, a friend who had been waiting for their return. The craggy hills and ancient forests seemed to hum with energy, their timeless presence watching over the pair as they made their way toward the rivers that had once been the lifeblood of the kingdoms of the Old North. "I never thought it would come to this," Edwin said softly as they walked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "To think that the Old North, with all its history and glory, is still here, hidden, waiting for someone to awaken it." Tien glanced over at her, noting the mix of awe and determination in her eyes. They had both come so far, and yet they had only just begun to understand the depth of what lay ahead. "The Old North is more than just a place," Tien replied, his voice steady, despite the rising excitement within him. "It's a story, a legacy, a heartbeat that never truly stopped, no matter how much time passed. We are the ones who've been chosen to bring that heartbeat back to life." Edwin nodded, though she didn't speak again. The words between them had become fewer, but their shared understanding was enough. They both knew what was at stake. The journey took them through fields that stretched out like vast, empty canvases, painted with the muted hues of twilight. The silence between them was filled with the sound of their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered earth. As they continued, the distant roar of a river reached their ears, a familiar, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse in time with the very heartbeat of the land. When they finally reached the river's edge, the sight before them was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The water, though cold and swift, was crystal clear, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. The river wound its way through the land, twisting and turning like the threads of an ancient tapestry, its course as old as the earth itself. "This is it," Tien whispered, his voice reverberating softly in the night. "Where the rivers meet." The words echoed in his mind, and for a moment he stood still, gazing at the water, as if waiting for it to reveal its secrets. But nothing stirred. The river flowed steadily, its current never ceasing, its waters dark and mysterious, carrying with them the history of ages long past. Edwin stepped forward, her eyes scanning the riverbank, her senses heightened. "There's something here," she murmured, more to herself than to Tien. "Something ancient." Tien nodded. He could feel it too, the pull of something old and powerful, buried just beneath the surface. The stones at the river's edge were worn smooth by centuries of flowing water, but there was something different about them, something that whispered of forgotten knowledge. "We need to search," Tien said, taking a step toward the river. "The book mentioned the stones. We have to find them." The two of them spread out, their movements deliberate and careful. The night was still, the air thick with the weight of anticipation, and the land seemed to hold its breath. Tien's eyes scanned the ground, searching for any sign, any clue that would lead them to the next step in their journey. And then, at the farthest edge of the river, Tien saw it, a stone, large and flat, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in ancient markings. The runes were faint, worn down by time and weather, but there was no mistaking what it was. It was the key. "This is it," Tien said, his voice low but filled with certainty. Edwin hurried over to him, her eyes wide with excitement as she knelt beside the stone. "It's a marker," she said, her fingers gently tracing the runes. "This is what we've been looking for." Tien crouched beside her, his hand hovering over the stone. The air around them seemed to vibrate, charged with an energy that hummed through his fingertips. The markings on the stone were the same as those in the book, the same language, the same symbols. They had found the place where the ancient power lay hidden, waiting to be awakened. "I think we need to activate it," Tien said, his voice filled with awe. "Somehow, we need to connect with it, to unlock the power." Edwin nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There must be a way. This stone is a part of the land's memory, its history. We have to reach it." The two of them stood together, staring at the stone, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall silent. The wind stilled, the river's roar softened, and the very earth beneath their feet seemed to pause in its endless cycle. Tien took a deep breath, his mind focused. Slowly he placed his hand upon the stone, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingertips. At first nothing happened, but then as he pressed harder, A faint pulse of energy surged through him, coursing up his arm and into his chest. The stone began to glow, the runes lighting up in a soft golden hue. The air around them thickened, charged with ancient power, as if the land itself was awakening. "This is it," Edwin whispered, her voice filled with awe. The glow from the stone intensified, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble ever so slightly. It was as though the earth itself was responding to their presence, to their touch, to the ancient connection they had just unlocked. Tien could feel it, the power, the history, the legacy of the Old North flowing through him. It was as if he had become a part of the land, the very soil beneath his feet, the river flowing beside him, and the wind whispering through the trees. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the glow faded, leaving behind only the stone, now dim and still. But the change was undeniable. The air felt different, alive with energy, and the land around them hummed with the weight of the knowledge that had just been awakened. "We've done it," Tien said, his voice filled with reverence. Edwin nodded, her face alight with the same realization. The Old North is waking up, and as they stood there, in the heart of the land they had come to love, they knew that their journey was far from over. The road ahead was long, but with each step, they were uncovering the forgotten past, revealing the secrets of the Old North, and awakening something that had been slumbering for centuries. The land had called to them, and they had answered, and now, nothing would ever be the same again. The final echo. The dawn was breaking over the Old North, its light soft and fragile, like the first breath after a long silence. The sky, a pale canvas of pink and lavender, stretched wide over the land, casting gentle hues across the mountains and forests that had stood for millennia. Ian stood at the edge of the riverbank, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first rays of light touched the world. Beside him, Edwin remained silent, both of them lost in the vastness of what they had uncovered. It had been a journey like no other, from the first whisper of the wind across the hills to the ancient stone they had uncovered at the river's edge. Everything had led to this moment. The book, the hidden markers, the forgotten history, every piece of the puzzle had come together, revealing not only the past but a future they had never imagined. The Old North was waking up, and with it, the echoes of an age-old power, a legacy that could not be erased, no matter how many centuries had passed. "We've unlocked it," Edwin said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she were speaking not to Senyan but to the land itself. "We've awakened the heart of the Old North." Ian nodded, his thoughts lost in the reverberations of her words. The stone they had touched, the energy they had unleashed, it had stirred something deep within the earth, something ancient and powerful. The very fabric of the land had shifted, as if the Old North had been waiting for them to arrive, to uncover its secrets, to remind the world of the empires and peoples that had once called it home. But now that they had awoken it, what came next? What was left for them to do in a world that had long forgotten its own origins? "We've uncovered the truth," Ian said, his voice steady but filled with awe. "But there's more. The Old North, its stories, its people, they've all been lost to time. We're the keepers of this knowledge now. We are the ones who will tell the stories of Reged, of Strathclyde, of Gododin, of the men and women who lived and died here, whose names are barely remembered." Edwin turned to him, her eyes bright, filled with the same understanding that had settled deep in his own chest. "And we will make sure their legacy is never forgotten." Together they looked out at the horizon, at the land that stretched before them. The rivers, the hills, the ancient forests, all of it was a part of them now. They had walked through the shadows of history, uncovered the forgotten, and brought to life what had long been buried in silence. And they would carry this responsibility forward. "Where do we go from here?" Edwin asked, her voice full of quiet anticipation. Ian's gaze swept across the land, and for the first time, he felt no uncertainty. He had come here seeking answers, seeking the truth about the Old North. But now, he understood. The journey was not just about discovering what had been lost, it was about ensuring that it would never be lost again. "We keep walking," Ian said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We share the stories, we make sure they echo through time, like the wind across these hills, and we bring the Old North back to life, one story at a time." As the first light of dawn spread across the land, the two of them turned away from the river and began to walk. With each step, they knew they were not just walking across the land, they were walking through history, through the memories of those who had come before them. The legacy of the Old North was now their charge, and they would carry it forward into the future, where it would never again fade into the shadows. The land behind them was alive with the echoes of the past, and ahead of them stretched the future, vast, unknown, and full of promise. But in that moment, as they walked side by side into the rising sun, the Old North was awake, and its story was far from over. And so the tale of the Old North came to its end, not with a fading echo but with the promise of a new beginning. And so, the echoes of battle fade into the distance, and the ancient lands of Britain, once shaped by the Romans, continue to whisper their secrets. This chapter of history is far from over, and as the dust settles, new kingdoms rise and fall, forever intertwined with the past. The story of Britain's struggle after Rome will remain in the winds, carried through the ages. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with those who might also find themselves captivated by the mysteries of history. What do you think? Could the old world have survived longer? How might things have turned out differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theories and reflections. Until the next chapter, let the past guide you, and may your dreams be filled with the ancient whispers of those who came before.